Chapter 1145. The Peak Stage of the Shattering Void Tear. In the starry sky, the martial saint was silent. He found it hard to believe. The woman in the plain dress had killed one of their super swordsman powerhouses, and it seemed like she had only used a single slash. At this moment, the Tendo suddenly laughed and said, "You don't believe me?" The martial saint gazed at Tendo. Tendo chuckled and said, "I've fought her in the past, so I know Dao Yi's strength." Hearing this, the martial saint stared at the Tendo and asked, "Did you really fight with her?" Tendo nodded, his expression calm. "We've exchanged blows and her strength is really only at the peak stage of the shattering void tear. The reason why she's strong is because her swordsman has reached the pinnacle. Of course, there's another reason, and that's because all of you have been looking down on her. If I'm not wrong, after she went up, you also looked down on her, right?" The warrior saint said in a deep voice. A sword saint who was not much weaker than Arrow fought with her. In the end he was killed by a single slash. As she spoke, she looked towards Tendo. If she was only at the peak stage of the shattering void tear, she definitely couldn't have done this. Tendo said with a straight face, "Do you know why you were instantly killed?" The martial sage looked at Tendo and asked, "Why?" The Tendo smiled and said, "She has a secret technique that can raise her realm to the origin, returning realm-breaking realm for a short period of time. However, it can only last for a quarter of an hour. If you go to find her after a quarter of an hour, she will definitely die, because at that time she was at her weakest." The martial saint fell silent. The Tendo suddenly laughed and said, "Don't tell me you guys think that she has reached the Gui Yuan breaking realm?" Martial saint said softly, "To be honest, we feel that she might have reached the legendary release 1. Of course, this is just a guess." "Nonsense." Tendo suddenly shook his head. "You all are simply speaking nonsense. How could she have reached the self-release realm? I'm telling you, I haven't even reached self-release realm. Moreover, with all due respect, if she really reaches self-release, do you think she will let you go? Why doesn't she dare to fight her way to the upper realm and get rid of all of you? Because she did not have the strength to do so. Actually, she's also afraid of you." The martial saint fell silent. The Tendo continued, "All of you have made many mistakes along the way. For example, you underestimated me from the start. Sir Martial Saint, you sent an envoy and a formation to imprison me. Tell me, aren't you stupid? And Zhou Xian, you actually sent these two people to deal with him. Are you trying to give him your heads? Yet now, all of you are still making a mistake by actually looking down on that woman in a plain dress. Let me give all of you a suggestion. If all of you want to deal with that woman in a plain dress, then the best way is to send out all your extraordinary experts to besiege her and not give her any chance to escape. Kill her in a single strike. Otherwise, once you kill Zhou Xian, she will take revenge on you." The martial saint remained silent. The Tendo smiled. "I finally know why you were chased down by the experts of the 6th dimension." Martial sage looked at Tendo and Tendo smiled and said, "Because of your indecisiveness. You're afraid of wolves in front of you and tigers behind you. Let me tell you, now is the best time for you to kill that woman in a plain dress. According to what I know, she wants to break through to the origin-breaking realm. Once she reaches that level, you'll be finished. Therefore, if you want to kill her, the best way is to do as I said just now. Send out all your extraordinary experts to besiege her and kill her in a single strike." The martial saint suddenly said, "Miss Tendo seems to want her dead." The Tendo smiled. "I want all of you to die." The martial saint, Tiandao, giggled. "This is what I really think. All right, I still have many things to do. Goodbye." With that, she turned around and disappeared into the distance. In the starry sky, the martial saint was silent for a long time before softly saying, "That's right, how could that woman reach self-release?" With that, he turned around and disappeared. The Tendo returned to Zhou Xian's side. At this moment, Zhou Xian was still crazily absorbing the power of the earth. Because of the great Dao law, everything was going smoothly. Just like that, after about 3 days, the desert where Zhou Xian was had disappeared. 1,000 li of scarlet land. At this moment, Zhou Xian stood up. The moment he stood up, a majestic aura surged out of his body like a storm, and the ground around him trembled. At the same time, the great Dao law suddenly appeared between his eyebrows. The Tendo faintly smiled. Yes. Zhou Xian clenched his hands and in an instant, a thin layer of armor appeared on his body. Earth armor. This time he felt completely different from before. This earth armor was not weaker than his Taiji shield. The Tendo suddenly smiled and said, "It's not enough." Yi Xian looked at the Tendo and the Tendo smiled. Right now your body has gathered many kinds of energy, but you haven't completely softened them and turned them into one kind of energy. Simply put, you've just started cultivating the 5 elements absolute body. When we've collected all the attributes, that will be the most difficult time. Whether or not you can cultivate the 5 elements absolute body will depend on your own luck. Yi Xian nodded. Understood. The Tendo smiled and said, let's go, I'll take you somewhere. With that she disappeared with Yi Xian. Soon the two of them came to a dense forest. Yi Xian looked around. He could not see the end of this dense forest. Moreover, this dense forest gave off a primitive aura, giving off a faint sense of oppression. The Tendo faintly smiled and said, this dense forest has existed since Tendo's time. I've always protected it, otherwise it would have disappeared too. With that she walked towards the inside of the forest. Yi Xian followed the Tendo. From time to time the sound of birds chirping could be heard in the dense forest. Yi Xian discovered that the spiritual energy in this dense forest was very abundant, more than 10 times better than outside. If it appeared outside it would definitely cause countless people to go crazy. However, there shouldn't be many people who would dare to have any ideas about this place. After all, this was a place protected by the Tendo. Regarding this woman, he was also afraid of her. The Tendo smiled and said, this place should be the last pure land in this cosmos. Yi Xian asked, Miss Tendo, with your strength, you should be able to leave this cosmos. Am I right? The Tendo nodded. As long as I want to, I can leave at any time. Speaking of which, the 6th dimension even invited me. They invited me to go to the 6th dimension. I don't need to do anything and I will be treated very well. Yi Xian was somewhat puzzled. Then why don't you go? The Tendo glanced at Yi Xian and said with a smile, this is home. Home. Yi Xian was silent. For him, wherever his sister was, that was home. The Tendo suddenly stopped. Not far in front of her there was an emerald green sapling. The Tendo smiled and said, this sapling is the life heart of this cosmos. Now I will give it to you. After saying that, she pointed her finger, and the life heart directly entered the space between Yi Xian's eyebrows. Boom. Yi Xian's body was instantly wrapped in an emerald green light. At this moment he felt endless energy. This kind of energy was warm and very comfortable. Tiandao smiled. This heart of life has a special ability, and that is healing. Its healing ability is only slightly inferior to the purple qi in your body. However, it has an ability that your purple qi doesn't have, and that is, it can perfectly fuse with your physical body, turning your body into a body of life. Simply put, in the future, in short, when you fight with others, as long as you are not seriously injured or killed by the other party, it can let your body heal itself. Hearing this, Yi Xian suddenly became excited. Self-healing? This was too important. In the future, if he fought with others, as long as the other party didn't have the ability to kill him instantly, it would be difficult for him to die even if he wanted to. Who could kill him? At this time the Tendo said, absorb it into your body first. When all the elemental energies are gathered, we will start to cultivate the 5 elements extreme physique. Now what you need to do is to collect these elemental energies. Yi Xian nodded. He slowly closed his eyes and began to concentrate on absorbing the life heart's energy. About 6 hours later, Yi Xian opened his eyes, and at this moment, a layer of emerald green light appeared on his body. Just as Yi Xian was about to speak, he suddenly turned his head and looked around. He found that the spiritual energy in the surroundings began to slowly dissipate. Yi Xian looked at the Tendo a little puzzled. This is... The Tendo smiled and said, the life heart is the core of this place. Now that it has been absorbed by you, the spiritual energy here will slowly dissipate, and then it will become the same as outside. Yi Xian said in a low voice, Miss Tendo, you... The Tendo interrupted Yi Xian's words. Do you want to ask me why I gave it to you? Yi Xian nodded. The Tendo blinked. Because I am scheming against you, he. Yi Xian. The Tendo smiled. Let's go. After saying this, she turned and left. Yi Xian glanced at the Tendo, feeling quite complicated. After a while, the Tendo brought Yi Xian to a starry sky. The two stood in the starry sky. Standing in this vast starry sky, Yi Xian suddenly felt small. Humans were very powerful, but compared to this endless universe they were really too small. The Tendo suddenly smiled and said, look at how beautiful the starry sky is. Yi Xian looked at the Tendo. The Tendo was wearing a white dress, spotless. Her long hair fell over her shoulders and there was a smile on her face. At this moment, the starry sky seemed to lose its color in front of her. The Tendo gently stroked the hair beside her ear and said softly, "We can't see the light, but the light is always there." Saying this, she looked at Zhou Xian. "I remember you once said that in this world the strong are respected and the fist is the reason. In fact, what you said is not wrong. In a world where the strong are respected, even if you are reasonable but you don't have the fist, it is useless. However, people with strength should not bully honest people and should not bully those who do their duty. In my heart, the real strong should be the kind of people who are willing to reason with those who are weaker than them." Zhou Xian was silent. The Tendo looked at Zhou Xian and said with a smile, "A person's strength does not depend on how strong he is, nor does it depend on how many people he has, but on how he treats those who are weaker than him." Zhou Xian looked straight at the Tendo. "Miss Tendo, why are you telling me this?" The Tendo said with a smile, "I'm just saying it casually. Just listen." Zhou Xian said in a deep voice, "You will destroy humanity for this universe, right?" The Tendo patted Zhou Xian's shoulder lightly. "In this universe there are not only humans. Do you know how many living beings have been killed by humans in this universe? I'm not asking you to rebel against humanity, nor am I asking you to stand on my side. I just want you to understand that humans don't deserve to die, but the other living beings in this universe don't deserve to die either, and this universe doesn't deserve to die either." Saying this, she smiled mischievously. "Do you really think I don't have the ability to destroy all humans?" Chapter 1146. Destroy all humans. Zhou Xian glanced at Tendo. Does this woman not have the ability to destroy humans? In his opinion, she probably does. Not only is this woman strong, but her intelligence is also ridiculously high. How can humans fight against her? At this moment, Tendo spread out her right hand and said softly, "Gather." As soon as she said that, countless star energy suddenly surged out from the surrounding starry sky. At this moment, the star energy filled the entire starry sky. Seeing this scene, Zhou Xian's expression instantly became incomparably solemn. Just how strong was the heavenly axiom? He doesn't know. He only knows that this woman is definitely much stronger than he imagined. At this moment, the star energy in the surrounding starry sky suddenly surged into Zhou Xian's body. Boom. In an instant, Zhou Xian directly turned into a starlight person. Tendo looked at Zhou Xian. "Calm your chi and focus, properly absorb these star energy." Zhou Xian nodded. He sat down cross-legged and concentrated on absorbing the star energy. When the star energy surged in, Zhou Xian felt like his body is surging like a wave. It is somewhat difficult to suppress. Tendo suddenly said, "Don't suppress it, use guidance, let it automatically fuse with your body." Zhou Xian nodded. He no longer suppressed the star energy, slowly guiding it to fuse with his body. Gradually, Zhou Xian's body started to absorb the star energy. Just like this, after about a day, countless star energy fused with his body. But here comes the problem. That is, there is too much elemental energy in his body. These elemental energy have all gathered in his body. It has already started to repel each other. Zhou Xian looked at Tendo. Tendo walked in front of Zhou Xian, her right hand lightly pressed on Zhou Xian's shoulder. In an instant, all the elemental energy in Zhou Xian's body was completely suppressed. Tendo smiled. "It's done." Zhou Xian said solemnly, "Forcefully suppressing it like this, will there be an accident?" Tendo nodded. "Yes." Zhou Xian was speechless. Tendo added, "But not for the time being. Let's go to the next place." Zhou Xian hesitated for a moment before he said, "Are there any more elemental energies to absorb?" Tendo nodded. "There's another one." With that, she turned around and left. Zhou Xian hesitated for a moment before following them. Right now he could only trust this Tendo. However, the other party probably had no intention of harming him, because if the other party wanted to harm him, there was no need for them to play these games. Right now he definitely couldn't beat this Tendo. Not long after, Zhou Xian followed Tendo to a desolate land. Zhou Xian looked around. The surroundings were filled with an eerie aura. Tendo looked around and said softly, "This was once a battlefield." Zhou Xian looked at Tendo. "Battlefield?" Tendo nodded. "There was a great battle here and many people and living beings died." Zhou Xian looked around and said, "People from Tendo's era?" Tendo smiled. "Yes, they were from the same era as me. However, those people were outsiders." Zhou Xian asked, "Who fought them?" Tendo pointed at himself and said, "Me." Yi Xian was struck dumb. Then he said, "You fought them?" Tendo nodded. "Yes." Yi Xian said in a deep voice, "You fought them alone?" Tendo nodded. "Yes." Yi Xian looked at Tendo. "Were there many of them?" Tendo nodded. "There were many of them, but I killed them all. I've buried them here forever." As she spoke, she looked at Yi Xian. "Awesome, right?" Yi Xian was speechless. Tendo suddenly spread out her right hand and gestured. "Rise." As soon as she said that, the ground in front of Yi Xian suddenly cracked open. Then countless spirits floated up from the ground. When these spirits appeared, the surroundings instantly turned into purgatory. When these spirits saw Tendo, they immediately roared madly as if they wanted to eat Tendo alive. Yi Xian said softly, "Do they hate you?" Tendo smiled. "I imprisoned them for hundreds of thousands of years. They were imprisoned here and lost their freedom, but they can't die. Do you think they hate me?" Yi Xian glanced at the spirits. Apart from hatred, there was also deep fear and dread in their eyes. Tendo looked at those spirits and smiled. "I like it when you see me in a bad mood but can't do anything about it." Yi Xian was speechless. The spirits roared in a frenzy. They wanted to pounce on the heavenly Tao, but they were locked in place by chains as thin as hair. Tendo looked at Yi Xian. Being imprisoned underground, unable to come out, unable to die. They can only face the darkness endlessly. Do you think it's cruel? Yi Xian nodded. It's cruel. Being imprisoned underground, only able to face the darkness and for hundreds of thousands of years. This was more than cruel. It was simply inhumane. If it was him, let alone hundreds of thousands of years, he wouldn't even be able to hold on for dozens of days. Yi Xian looked at those spirits. He had to say that these guys were really miserable. Right at this moment, a voice suddenly sounded out from among the spirits. "Sir, we've already been punished. Please release us." Tendo looked over. It was a middle-aged man. Not only were there iron chains on his body, but there were also some mysterious blood-red runes. Tendo looked at the middle-aged man and smiled. "Do you want to be released?" The middle-aged man nodded. Tendo shook his head. "Actually, I don't want to release you. I want you to be imprisoned here forever." The spirits instantly started roaring when they heard this. The middle-aged man suddenly roared. "Shut up." Hearing this, the spirits around him immediately stopped. The middle-aged man looked at Tendo. "What do you want us to do?" Tendo didn't answer the middle-aged man. Instead, he looked at Yi Xian. "Do you know why they're trapped here?" Yi Xian shook his head. Tendo chuckled. "Because they've committed an unforgivable crime. They used living people to refine themselves. Not only did they use living people to refine themselves, they even used the countless living beings in this universe to cultivate." Yi Xian frowned. "They used living beings to cultivate?" Tendo nodded. They seized the vitality of countless living beings in exchange for powerful cultivation. All those years ago, a few tens of millions of living beings in this universe died miserably at their hands because of a moment of carelessness on my part. It wasn't a normal death, it was a tragic death. Because those living beings suffered inhuman torture before they died. Their cultivation methods are extremely cruel. It's completely unimaginable. Yi Xian glanced at the spirits. At this moment he felt that these fellows weren't so pitiful. Tendo turned around to look at the spirits and smiled. "I wanted to imprison all of you forever. But I can give all of you a chance now." The middle-aged man hurriedly said, "What chance?" Tendo pointed at Yi Xian. "Let him absorb it." Hearing this, the spirits were stunned. Soon, the middle-aged man said angrily, "Let him absorb it? You want to destroy our souls." Tendo smiled. "So you don't want your souls to be destroyed. It's fine." With that, she pressed down with her right hand. It didn't take long for the spirits to slowly sink into the ground. The spirits were instantly terrified when they saw this. "Return to the ground?" At this moment, the middle-aged man suddenly said, "We agree." Tendo withdrew her hand and smiled. "I don't like to force others. It's true. You can refuse. If you refuse, I won't destroy your souls." Yi Xian was speechless. The middle-aged man stared at Tendo. "We're willing." Tendo blinked. "Really?" The middle-aged man said fiercely, "Really?" Tiandao laughed. "Do you really want to beat me to death? Unfortunately you can't." "Huh." As she spoke, she looked at Yi Xian. "Am I very arrogant?" Yi Xian nodded. "Very arrogant." Tendo smiled. When dealing with evil people, you have to be more evil and arrogant than them. With that, she looked at the spirits. You can begin. The middle-aged man looked at Tendo. Remove these shackles for us. Heavenly Tao smiled and said, all right. As soon as she finished speaking, she waved her right hand. The shackles on the spirits disappeared without a trace. When the shackles disappeared, the middle-aged man suddenly roared. Kill. As soon as he finished speaking, he and the spirits around him charged at Tendo. Xian's face changed. These spirits were extremely strong. The weakest was at the sovereign realm when they were alive. Just as Xian was about to take out the soul-suppressing sword, Tendo shook her head and smiled. She flicked her sleeves. In an instant, all the spirits were frozen on the spot. They couldn't move. Xian was stunned. The spirits were also stunned. Tendo looked at Xian. Do you know what this is? Xian shook his head. Tendo smiled. It's called space freeze. It's a kind of space manipulation. Do you want to learn it? Xian nodded. Yes. Tendo laughed. I'll teach you after you finish cultivating the 5 elements absolute physique. She looked at the middle-aged man and the spirits. You weren't a match for me when you were alive. What's more now? The middle-aged man glared at Tendo. You will have retribution. Tendo laughed. You are a sinful person. You dare to talk about retribution? Don't you think it's funny? The middle-aged man glared at Tendo with hatred. I curse you. I curse you to die a horrible death. Tendo blinked. I'm so scared. Xian was speechless. The middle-aged man glared at Tendo. If looks could kill, Tendo would have died hundreds of times. Tendo looked at the spirits and shook her head. I don't have much time. I really don't want you to be free. You people should suffer for eternity. When she finished speaking, she waved her right hand. In an instant, the spirits were all enveloped by a mysterious force. In the next moment, the spirits surged towards Xian. Xian was about to dodge when Tendo suddenly said, absorb them. Let your soul-suppressing sword fuse with you. If you succeed, your soul-suppressing sword will become the second sword in the history of the 5 dimensions. Xian subconsciously asked, what's the first sword? Tendo's mouth curled up. My Tendo sword? Do you want it? If you do, I can give it to you. Xian asked. Free. Tendo nodded. Free. Xian was puzzled. Why are you giving it to me for free? Tendo blinked. Because I want to scheme against you. Huh. Xian was speechless. Chapter 1147. Absorb. Xian began to crazily absorb the Yin Soul's power. Not only him but the soul-suppressing sword was also absorbing. The current him and the soul-suppressing sword were one. The soul-suppressing sword was him. The soul-suppressing sword was different from the executing heaven sword. Along the way, the soul-suppressing sword had grown with him, and he had a lot of resonance with the soul-suppressing sword. As for the executing heaven sword, it was a divine weapon the moment it appeared, and it still lacked some tacit understanding with him. However, he was also slowly fusing with the executing heaven sword. In the field, those Yin souls had no power to resist at all, and could only be absorbed by Xian. Tendo's strength was too terrifying. Xian was truly afraid of this woman, because he had no idea what she was trying to do. What was her goal? He didn't know. He could no longer figure out her intentions. A mysterious woman. In the field, Tendo glanced at Xian, then walked to the side and sat down. She rested her chin on her knees with both hands and looked at Xian. No one knew what she was thinking. One day later, Xian had already absorbed all the Yin souls. Her soul-suppressing sword directly rushed out of his body and soared into the sky, straight into the starry sky. In an instant, the entire starry sky directly turned into a dead domain. A dead domain condensed from the aura of death. Below, Xian slowly closed his eyes. He opened his palm, and the soul-suppressing sword directly turned into a black light and entered his hand. The aura of death in the starry sky still did not dissipate. Xian looked at Tendo. I feel like my body is filled with death energy. Tendo smiled. Can you suppress it? Xian nodded. With the soul-suppressing sword, I can suppress it. Tendo opened her palm, and the soul-suppressing sword appeared in her hand. She looked at the soul-suppressing sword in her hand and smiled slightly, then handed the sword to Xian. This sword has absorbed the souls of countless evil people. There are countless evil thoughts in the sword. You should use this evil sword to kill evil people. Kill evil people. Xian nodded. I only kill those who deserve to be killed. The Tendo smiled and said, don't worry, I'm not asking you to change anything. Your nature is very good, so you don't need to change anything. Moreover, I am also very disgusted with some so-called righteous people because many people like to do evil things in the name of righteousness. Moreover, many people like to impose their own so-called standards of justice on others. So just be yourself. Xian glanced at the Tendo. Aren't you afraid that I'll harm you? Tendo blinked. Will you? Xian was silent. The Tendo laughed. Unless you call for help, you won't be able to defeat me in a short time. Xian looked at Tendo. What level have you reached? Tendo smiled mischievously. Guess. Xian shook his head. Guess my ass. The Tendo laughed and said, let's go, I'll bring you to a place. We can start cultivating the 5 elements extreme physique. After saying that, she turned around. The moment she turned around, she and Xian appeared in a bamboo house. It was the Tendo's elegant residence. Xian looked at the Tendo beside him. The Tendo sword that you told me about previously. The Tendo smiled and said, that's not urgent for now. Let's cultivate the 5 elements extreme physique first. Xian nodded. The Tendo hooked her jade-like finger lightly, and some ancient books suddenly flew out from the bookshelves. These ancient books steadily landed in front of Xian. There were more than 30 books. The Tendo pointed at those ancient books. Look at them carefully. Understand them thoroughly. Xian was a little puzzled. What are these? The Tendo smiled and said, they're all explanations about the elemental energy in your body. I've already rewritten them. You can read them directly. Pay more attention to the red dots that I've marked. Those are the important points. Xian nodded. He opened an ancient book. When he saw the contents, his expression changed. Xian looked up at the Tendo. The Tendo smiled and said, what's wrong? Xian said in a deep voice, you wrote all these? The Tendo shook her head. Not really. These are all written by some scholars and outstanding people from ancient and modern times. I just rewrote them and added some of my own ideas or improvements. Actually, you humans really have outstanding talents. Moreover, I have to say that you humans are really blessed by nature. Whether it's in terms of cultivation or growth, you humans have an ability that other races don't have. That is creation. You can create, you can change, and of course you can also destroy. Moreover, your destruction is stronger than that of any other race. Xian was silent. The Tendo smiled and said, read carefully. I'm not asking you to discuss life with me. What you need to do now is to become stronger. Because before long, there will be many things that you will have to face alone. Xian nodded and then lowered his head to read the book. The Tendo immediately left the bamboo house and did not disturb Xian. Outside the bamboo house, the Tendo sat on a stone bench. In front of her there was a chessboard. The Tendo said softly, all living beings are not chess pieces. After saying that, she waved her right hand lightly. The chessboard disappeared. At this moment, a little girl suddenly appeared beside the Tendo. The one who came out was Xiaolinger. Behind her there was a little monster. It was the war sky beast. Xiaolinger walked in front of the Tendo. She looked at the Tendo and said, beautiful sister, can you do me a small favor? The Tendo looked at Xiaolinger and said with a smile, what is it? Xiaolinger blinked and said, can I break through? The Tendo was stunned and then said with a smile, you want to break through? Xiaolinger nodded and said, yes. The Tendo asked with a smile, why do you want to break through? Xiaolinger glanced at the bamboo house and said softly, I want to help Big Brother. The Tendo glanced at the bamboo house and said with a smile, are you not afraid of humans? Xiaolinger slightly lowered her head and said, I am afraid. Humans are the worst. The Tendo said with a smile, but you are not afraid of him, right? Xiaolinger nodded and said, Big Brother is very good. The Tendo smiled and said, indeed he is okay. If he has the intention to use you, he will lose a lot. After saying that, she paused and said, at any time, people must not lose their kindness. Xiaolinger held the Tendo's hand and said, beautiful sister, can I break through? The Tendo said with a smile, of course you can. After saying that, she leaned over and whispered a few words in Xiaolinger's ear. Xiaolinger's eyes lit up and said, is this okay? The Tendo blinked and said, you can try. Xiaolinger nodded and said, okay. After saying that, she turned and left. The war sky beast hurriedly followed. In front of the Tendo it was too unnatural. In the field the Tendo shook her head and said with a smile, "Little guy. You are really blessed by heaven." She could naturally see the good fortune that Xiao had. At this moment she looked up at the sky, her eyes piercing through the galaxy and looking into the distance. She did not know what she saw, but gradually her eyebrows slightly furrowed. After a moment of silence, the Tendo withdrew her gaze and fell into deep thought. In the bamboo house Xian was still reading. He had to admit that when he started reading the first ancient book he was already fascinated. No, it was obsessed. The value of these ancient books was too great. He had never heard of some of the knowledge involved in them before. In the past he only knew about cultivation such as space. After reading the ancient book about space written by the Tendo, he realized that space was much more complicated than he had imagined. Not only space, but there were also many detailed descriptions of various kinds of energy which he had never heard of before. In this way, about 3 days later Xian had finished reading all the ancient books. However, he still wanted to read the ancient books collected by the Tendo, but he was stopped by the Tendo. The Tendo appeared in front of Xian and said with a smile, "You can't read them now." Xian asked, "When can I read them?" The Tendo smiled and said, "You have to cultivate the 5 elements extreme physique first." Xian nodded and said, "All right." The Tendo nodded and said, "Come with me." After saying that she turned and walked outside. Xian followed. After a while the Tendo brought him to a pool. Above the pool was a waterfall. The Tendo pointed at the pool and said, "Take off all your clothes and go in." "Take off all his clothes." Xian blinked and said, "Can I not take off all my clothes?" The Tendo smiled and said, "You will be shattered by your strength later anyway." Xian thought for a while and then took off all his clothes. The Tendo was watching the whole process. Xian looked at the Tendo and said, "Aren't you going to leave?" The Tendo shook her head and said, "People with filthy thoughts will see everything as filthy." Xian was speechless. Wasn't she insulting him? The Tendo pointed at the pool in the distance and said, "Go in." Xian nodded and walked into the pool. It was cold and there was nothing special about it. The Tendo pointed and a white light entered Xian's head. Soon a lot of information flowed into Xian's brain. Invisible physique art. At this moment the Tendo suddenly said, "This is a mental cultivation method. There are countless types of energy in your body. You have to use your body as a formation and use this mental cultivation method as a guide to gather all the energy in your body. Then your body will become like this heaven and earth, able to contain everything. To put it simply, what you have to do is to make your body become like this heaven and earth. This heaven and earth can contain these types of energy, and your body must also be able to. Only then can you be considered to have cultivated the 5 elements extreme physique." Xian nodded and began to urge the energy in his body. Gradually, the water around him began to surge violently, and at this time, a formation suddenly appeared at the bottom of the water. When this formation appeared, the water around Xian instantly calmed down, and Xian also became illusory as if he wasn't in this world. Xian looked at the Tendo and the Tendo smiled and said, "This is a kind of formation equivalent to the ability of the shattering void tear, making you in a kind of illusory state. In this case, no matter how big the commotion you cause when you sprint, it won't cause any adverse effects to this real world." Xian nodded and said, "Understood." After saying this, he slowly closed his eyes and then began to cultivate according to the mental cultivation technique of the 5 elements extreme physique that the Tendo had given him. The Tendo glanced at Xian in the pool and remained silent, thinking about something. In a faraway galaxy, a middle-aged man stood silently. This person was the martial saint who had appeared in the lower realm. The martial saint stood just like that, and in the depths of the galaxy in front of him floated 3 pitch-black coffins. At this time, the coffin on the left suddenly trembled, and immediately after, an illusory figure suddenly appeared not far from the martial saint. In the instant that this illusory figure appeared, the whole galaxy directly became illusory. The martial saint looked at the illusory figure and bowed slightly. "Shen Master." The Shen Master said, "Speak." The martial saint said in a low voice, "That plain-dressed woman has already entered the higher realm. I request to mobilize 12 ascetic cultivators, 36 defiant cultivators, and an ultimate killing formation to kill her in this realm." As he said this, he paused and then said, Just in case, I request that the Xian master send a clone to go with us. The Xian master laughed lightly. 12 elites at the peak of the Shattering Void tier, 36 at the peak of the Dominator tier, and an ultimate killing formation that can destroy heaven and earth. Aren't you thinking too highly of her? The martial saint said in a low voice. Previously, because we underestimated the enemy, we lost many elites. Thus, we cannot underestimate the enemy this time. Although this woman is only at the peak of the Shattering Void tier, she is a swordsman and her battle prowess is extraordinary. Moreover, I feel that the words of that Tendo may not be true. Her strength may be slightly stronger than what Tendo said. Thus, just in case, it is best that we send all our elites to kill her in this realm to eliminate any future troubles. As he said this, he turned to look at the faraway galaxy and said softly, "She is about to leave this realm, we do not have time." P.S. Personally, I do not like asking for votes because I feel that creating works is a kind of hobby, and if it is related to monthly votes or something like that, it seems a bit tacky. However, you also know that this monthly vote is guaranteed every month, and if you do not vote, there will be no more next month. As far as I'm concerned, I despise wastefulness, so I think it's better for you to invest. Put an end to waste starting with us. Chapter 1148. In the galaxy, the Xian master was silent for a moment and then said, "Fine, I'll let this clone go with you." The martial saint nodded, turned and disappeared. The next moment, dozens of powerful auras flashed through the galaxy. At the end of the distant galaxy, the woman in the plain dress looked at the depths of the galaxy, flying through the air. The woman in the plain dress had her hands behind her back, her face expressionless. Her plain dress was spotless, like an otherworldly fairy. Xianxia. This was her original name. In this life, this name could only be used by one person. Thinking of a certain person, the woman in the plain dress couldn't help but smile. This faint smile was enough to make the entire galaxy pale. Obsession? Actually, this wasn't her obsession, but the only reason she was still alive. The woman in the plain dress looked up at the galaxy. Soon she would leave this realm. At this moment, the space in front of her suddenly trembled, and the next moment, dozens of figures suddenly appeared in front of her. The one in the lead was the clone of the Holy Master, and beside him was the martial saint. Behind them, there were 12 peak stage Shattering Void tier elites and 36 peak stage rulers. This lineup was not weak even in the 6th dimension. The woman in the plain dress looked at them, her expression calm. The Holy Master looked at the woman in the plain dress, and frowned because he couldn't sense her. Even he couldn't sense her. The Holy Master's expression gradually became serious. "How should I address you?" The woman in the plain dress looked at the Holy Master but didn't speak. The Holy Master stared at the woman in the plain dress. "Lady, we don't want to kill you. As long as you promise not to become an enemy of the higher realm, we can let you go." At this moment he actually had a sliver of intention to retreat. He couldn't see through the woman in front of him and felt that she was a bit dangerous. The woman in the plain dress looked around. "Is there anyone else?" The Holy Master frowned. At this moment the martial saint suddenly laughed. "Are we not enough?" The woman in the plain dress looked at the martial saint, and at this moment, an old man beside the martial saint suddenly laughed. "I don't like to waste time. Let me deal with this woman first." After saying this, he directly charged at the woman in the plain dress. Peak stage Shattering Void tier. When he charged at the woman in the plain dress, the space around her and him directly became illusory, shattering the void. The old man looked at the woman in a simple dress as a savage smile appeared on the corners of his mouth. He didn't hold back this time. An all-out attack. However, when he was only 10 feet away from the woman in the plain dress, his eyes suddenly widened. In the next moment his head flew into the air. Even though his head had flown out, his body was still charging towards the woman in the plain dress. Very quickly, his body fell to the ground a few feet away from the woman in the plain dress. He was decapitated. Everyone in the surroundings was stunned by this scene. At this moment, the Saint Master's expression became unprecedentedly solemn. Instant kill. An ultimate elite at the peak of the Shattering Void tier was instantly killed? At this moment the martial saint's mind went blank. Peak stage of the Shattering Void tier? This woman was only at the peak stage of the Shattering Void tier? The Saint Lord looked at the woman in the plain dress and was about to speak when the woman in the plain dress suddenly took a step forward. One step was one sword. Before anyone could react, the Divine Master's clone was directly pierced by a flash of sword light, and behind him, the heads of the 11 Shattering Void Tier elites and the 36 Dominators flew into the air before they could even react. When their heads flew into the air, their eyes were wide open, filled with disbelief. Instant kill. All of them were instantly killed. This was the last thought in their minds. The Saint Lord's eyes were wide open, filled with disbelief and terror. Terror. He wanted to speak but he couldn't. As if he sensed something, the Saint Lord suddenly turned around. In the depths of the distant galaxy, a coffin suddenly cracked open, and in the next moment, a shrill scream resounded from within the coffin. No. There was despair in the voice. That sword had gone through the clone and directly struck the main body. A single sword strike had severed the Saint Lord's life, karma, and reincarnation. In the galaxy, the Saint Lord stared fixedly at the woman in the plain dress. At this moment, his eyes were filled with terror. He really wanted to speak but he couldn't, because both his main body and physical body had been destroyed. What kind of sword strike was this? The Saint Lord raised his head to look at the horizon, his eyes filled with unwillingness. In the battlefield, the martial saint was still alive. That sword strike just now hadn't killed him. At this moment, the martial saint's mind was completely blank. At this moment, the woman in the plain dress walked in front of him, glanced at the martial saint and said, "Is that enough?" After saying that, she was already thousands of kilometers away, and the martial saint's neck suddenly split open. In the galaxy, the martial saint's face suddenly became ferocious. Tendo. Tendo. Ah. His voice was like the roar of a wild beast shaking the galaxy. In the lower realm, beside the pool, Tendo sat quietly. At this moment she suddenly raised her head, blinked, and then put on an innocent expression. "I only suggested that you guys hit her, it was just a suggestion. I didn't ask you guys to really hit her, so what does it have to do with me? I'm innocent." The martial saint, Tendo, shook her head and sighed. "Your group was wiped out and you blame me? How innocent am I? I'm just sitting at home and the blame falls from the sky." At this moment the space around Zhou Xian in the distance suddenly trembled. Tendo looked at Zhou Xian. She had been sitting here for a while, but Zhou Xian had not succeeded yet. She wanted to go for a stroll, but at this moment Zhou Xian could not leave her side. This 5 elements extreme physique was not an ordinary cultivation technique, especially when Zhou Xian's body had gathered so many different types of energy. One careless move, and Zhou Xian could suddenly die on the spot. Therefore she had to keep looking at Zhou Xian. Time passed bit by bit. Zhou Xian's brows gradually furrowed, as if he had encountered some difficulty. Tendo stood up and said softly, "Don't be anxious, take your time, I'm here." Zhou Xian nodded slightly. He folded his hands in front of his chest, and slowly began to suppress the chaotic energy in his body. About 2 hours later, the water in the pool began to boil. Seeing this, Tendo frowned slightly. She pressed her right hand lightly, and the energy emitted from Zhou Xian's body instantly vanished. At this moment, Zhou Xian's body suddenly turned into a ball of fire, and the next moment the fire on his body suddenly disappeared, and he turned into a man of ice, and in less than a breath's time he turned into a man of thunder. The attribute energy in Zhou Xian's body kept changing. Tendo's expression was also not as relaxed as before. This 5 elements extreme physique was created by her, but no one had cultivated it before. It could be said that this 5 elements extreme physique was theoretically reasonable and feasible. But no one had practiced it before. Therefore she was a little worried. After an unknown period of time, the water around Zhou Xian suddenly began to disappear bit by bit. Tendo looked at Zhou Xian and Zhou Xian's body gradually trembled. At this moment he was a little panicked, because he realized that the energy in his body was a little out of control. Tendo suddenly said, "Calm your chi and focus. Don't follow my mental cultivation method, follow your own ideas and do whatever you think is suitable." "Don't follow the mental cultivation method?" Zhou Xian was a little confused. Tendo said again, "From the current situation, there may be some shortcomings in the mental cultivation method, so you need to perfect it yourself." Annoyed and insufficient, Zhou Xian's face was full of black lines. "Can I scold you?" Tendo giggled. "Scold me all you want, I'm not angry, I won't take revenge on you really." Zhou Xian. He had to admit that he did not have any temper towards this woman at all. Ignoring Tendo, Zhou Xian calmed down and began to slowly cultivate the 5 elements extreme physique mental cultivation method. Invisible extreme physique. Succeed or die trying. Right now there were too many attributes in his body. If he could not perfectly integrate them, they might kill him. He could not always let Tendo help him suppress them, right? Next to him, Tendo just looked at Zhou Xian. She was ready to attack at any time. One day later, the aura around Zhou Xian gradually calmed down. At the side, Tiandao's expression also gradually relaxed. Another day passed. On this day, Zhou Xian, who was sitting in the water, suddenly opened his eyes. 2 balls of lightning suddenly flew out from his eyes at the same time. There were all kinds of flames, ice currents, death chi, earth chi. In short, it was very fancy. At this moment, Zhou Xian suddenly took a deep breath, and soon all the energy around him returned to his body, and his body trembled. Zhou Xian looked at Tendo. Tendo blinked. Did you succeed? Zhou Xian flew in front of Tendo. He said excitedly, it should be. Tendo pointed at a certain part of Zhou Xian. Shouldn't you put on your clothes first? Zhou Xian smiled, then quickly put on his clothes. He slowly clenched his fists. At this moment he felt several different kinds of energy. This feeling was a little strange. Tendo lightly touched Zhou Xian's chest. She blinked. It seems to be a success. Seems. Zhou Xian smiled. It should be a success. Tendo looked at Zhou Xian. Can I punch you? I promise I won't kill you. Faster, thief. Zhou Xian quickly said, No. I'll try it myself. After saying that, he took out the executing heaven sword and suddenly slashed at his body. This slash, he used all his strength, but the executing heaven sword couldn't even leave a mark on his body. Seeing this scene, Zhou Xian was stunned, and in the next moment he suddenly slashed at his throat. This time there was no trace of his throat. Zhou Xian was excited. Nothing happened at all. His current physical body was many times stronger than the indestructible golden body from before, and it could be said that now even a shattering void tier elite couldn't do anything to him. Zhou Xian looked at his own physical body. He laughed loudly, and after laughing for a while he looked at Tendo. Come, punch me. Tendo blinked, and in the next moment her fist landed on Zhou Xian's body. Ping. Zhou Xian instantly flew out, and this flight he flew no less than several tens of thousands of meters, and the space he passed directly collapsed inch by inch, and his physical body also collapsed inch by inch at this moment. Ah! In the horizon a heart-wrenching scream came. Chapter 1149. Zhou Xian was lying on the ground. There was a pool of blood on the ground. At this moment his mind was blank. This is the 5 elements extreme physique. At this time Tendo appeared beside Zhou Xian. She looked at Zhou Xian and smiled. Are you okay? Zhou Xian looked at Tendo. Did I fail? Tendo shook her head. You succeeded. Zhou Xian was puzzled. Then why am I still in such a miserable state? I can't even take one punch from you? Tendo blinked. Maybe I am too strong. Zhou Xian was speechless. Tendo pulled Zhou Xian up and smiled. There are really not many who can take one punch from me. For example, the martial sage from before. He couldn't even take one punch from me. Zhou Xian looked at Tendo. In other words, Arrow is no match for you? Arrow. Tendo smiled. Arrow is a little stronger than the martial sage. However, she can't beat me now because I have lived longer than her. Zhou Xian said in a deep voice. How strong are you? Tendo blinked. Do you want to hear the truth or a lie? Zhou Xian looked at Tendo. Lie first. The heavenly Tao looked up at the sky and looked down on the world. In the 9 heavens and 10 earths only I am supreme. I Moon Yen Yen am invincible and peerless. Zhou Xian suddenly said. So, I want to hear the truth. Tendo looked at Zhou Xian. Truth? Zhou Xian nodded. Tendo looked at Zhou Xian. As long as I want, the universe can disappear now. Zhou Xian. The Tendo laughed and said, I'm just joking with you. I'm not that powerful and I don't really like fighting. As she spoke, she lightly patted Zhou Xian's body. That punch just now was to let you understand that your 5 elements extreme physique isn't invincible, and that no cultivation technique or physical body is invincible. There will always be someone stronger than you, and it's definitely not wrong to keep a low profile. Just like when the plain-dressed woman was around, look at how low-key I was. I didn't even come out, so I was living well. Zhou Xian looked at Tendo. Is it because of her that you didn't come out? The Tendo laughed and said, Of course. She's so powerful and unreasonable. If I come out, what if she doesn't like me and attacks me with her sword? I'll die in vain. Zhou Xian said solemnly, Even you can't beat her? Tendo nodded. I can't beat her. He's too powerful. Her swordsmanship cultivation has already exceeded the scope of my understanding. In fact, she's not only powerful in swordsmanship, but her understanding of power is also very powerful. As she spoke, she paused and said, she gave birth to the sword because of her obsession. Her obsession has already surpassed the sword. It can be said that she doesn't rely on the sword, but the sword relies on her. For a swordsman to cultivate to the point that the sword can't leave her and even relies on her, don't you think that's amazing? Xian looked at the Tendo with a strange expression. You seem to admire her quite a lot. Tendo nodded slightly. I do admire her quite a lot, but her temper isn't very good. She's a little irritable. Let me tell you, she wanted to destroy the universe several times. This woman being in this universe is the universe's fortune, but also its misfortune. Xian said solemnly, if she really wants to destroy the universe, what should we do? The Tendo rolled her eyes at Xian. What can we do? We can't beat her, so we can only do nothing. Xian looked at the Tendo. Will you fight to the death with her for the sake of this universe? The Tendo shook her head. I'll escape, run far away. Xian was a little puzzled. Why? Don't you want to protect this universe? The Tendo sighed softly. Big brother, protecting this universe also depends on the situation. If it's the upper realm or the spirit tribe, I'll definitely play with them because there's hope and the chances of winning are 50-50. However, if she wants to destroy the universe, then it's not 50-50 but 10. Under such circumstances, if I fight to the death with her, there's no meaning other than sending myself to death. One can be ambitious, but one must know one's limits before doing anything. Don't do things that are beyond one's capabilities, because doing things that are beyond one's capabilities will not only cause one's own death, but it will also implicate the people around him. Xian gave the Tendo a thumbs up. He rarely admired people, but he had to admit that he admired the woman in front of him. The woman in front of him was really a little scary. This woman was really not pedantic at all. Moreover, she dared to face any problems in her heart. If she couldn't beat her, she didn't feel ashamed. If she couldn't beat her, she wouldn't provoke her. She could beat her, she would kill her. If she couldn't beat her and you still wanted to beat her, she would run. Most importantly, he didn't feel a trace of arrogance from this Tendo. Many powerhouses had their own arrogance, including Xiao Dao Arrow, but this Tendo didn't. She looked at everything very calmly, just like when she said that she couldn't beat the woman in the plain dress. She said it very calmly and didn't feel ashamed at all. I'm not as good as you, but I don't feel ashamed. Powerhouses weren't scary. What was scary was a super powerhouse with a humble and low-key heart. At this moment he was thinking about how sad the righteous gods in the era of the Tendo were. Going against this woman, wasn't that like going to the latrine with a lantern? At this time the Tendo suddenly said, your current physical strength is very strong. It can be said that even if Arrow and Xiao Dao join hands, they still can't break your physical defense. Of course, it doesn't mean that the two of them can't beat you, because right now you only have a strong physical body. In terms of martial arts, there is still a big gap between you and them. But this is normal, after all, Arrow is a veteran powerhouse. Her sword attainments and combat experience, even in the 6th dimension, is absolutely top level. As for Xiao Dao, her family is not simple. She is very knowledgeable and has a lot of treasures. Maybe she has a treasure that can break your physical body. But fortunately, both of them have a good relationship with you. Xian said in a deep voice. Xiao Dao's family? The Tendo nodded. Her background is not simple. Think about it, her current strength is not even 20% of her original strength. If she completely recovers, it can be said that if she completely recovers, I may not be able to beat her. At this point she seemed to think of something and sighed. She originally had hope of completely recovering and leaving here. Unfortunately, she was too arrogant and didn't put anyone in her eyes. Let me tell you, if you had met her back then, she wouldn't even have looked at you. She also suffered a great loss and knew that there is always someone better than you. That's why she changed her character. Otherwise, how could this woman be so arrogant? Xian said softly, is it because of that little white guy? The Tendo nodded. When she saw that little white guy, she was ecstatic because that little white guy could heal her injuries. Moreover, only that little guy could completely heal her injuries. At that time she directly tried to rob it, and then she was beaten. He was beaten. Xian, the Tendo looked around. After making sure that there was no one around, she looked at Xian and blinked. She was beaten so badly. Don't say that I said it. That woman is a bit stingy. Yi Xian, the Tendo suddenly sighed in a low voice. I have to say that man in green swordsman is really powerful. Fortunately there is him. Otherwise those spirits of Nine would have attacked. Yi Xian suddenly asked. Between the man in green and the woman in white, who is stronger? He had always wanted to ask this question. The Tendo was silent for a moment and then said, both of them have bad tempers. I think whoever is angrier is stronger. Yi Xian, the Tendo smiled and then said, let's not talk about them. Let's go, I will take you to get the Tendo sword. After saying that she turned and left. Yi Xian hurriedly followed. The Tendo sword. The upper dimension. There used to be 3 coffins somewhere in the starry sky, but only 2 remain now. There were some mysterious people in front of the coffins. There weren't many, only around 10 of them. They stood there silently as if they were waiting for something. Right at this moment the coffin on the right suddenly trembled. In next to no time the coffin suddenly opened, and a strand of abundant spirit energy floated out from within it. After that a man walked out. The mysterious people bowed slightly when they saw this man. Greetings, Hallmaster. Hallmaster. The former martial hall master of the 6th Dimension Alliance Hall, Wuxia. This name had once struck terror into countless people's hearts in the 6th dimension. Wuxia glanced at the coffin on the right. After a moment of silence he looked at a black-robed old man in front of him. They're all dead. The black-robed old man nodded. The Hallowed Lord and the others were completely annihilated. Wuxia slowly closed his eyes. We underestimated that woman's strength. She's at least at the peak of the Returnance realm and she might even be at the half-step void realm. Half-step void realm. Hearing this, everyone's expression changed. A super elite with such strength was no joke. Wuxia suddenly asked, she's already left this realm? The black-robed old man nodded. Yes, she has. Hearing this, Wuxia's tightly clenched right hand slowly relaxed. The woman was able to kill the Hallowed Lord's main body through the Hallowed Lord's clone. This strength was not something that Wuxia could resist. Wuxia raised his head and looked towards the depths of the starry sky. He was slightly puzzled. Why was there such a powerful person in the lower realm? This strength was a bit abnormal. After a long moment of silence, Wuxia suddenly said, I'll make a trip to the Spirit of Nine. In the meantime you all stay here and wait for my orders. After saying this he turned and disappeared into the depths of the starry sky. The current higher realm no longer had the ability to target the lower realm, because the higher realm's losses were too severe. 12 elites at the peak of the Shattering Void tier and 36 at the peak of the Ruler tier. This loss was truly devastating. Now if they wanted to seize the study room again, they could only borrow power and cooperate with the Spirit of Nine. Moreover, they had to cooperate with the Spirit of Nine, because the lower realm could not possibly sit still and wait for death. If the people of the lower realm counterattacked, whether it was that Tendo, Xiaodao or Arrow, they did not dare to underestimate them in the slightest. Especially Tendo. This time the higher realm could be said to have suffered greatly because of her. This woman was too vicious. P.S. A reader told me that if I updated 5 chapters a day I would definitely become popular. He said that after I became popular, I would have divinity, I would have dignity, and I had earned enough money. Then I would be able to update 1 chapter a day or even 1 chapter a month. To be honest, I'm a little tempted because I want to earn millions every month and become a god with 1 book. But I'm also a little worried, what if I'm still half dead after updating 5 chapters a day? Chapter 1150. Tendo brought Yi Xian to a starry sky. The 2 of them walked slowly in the starry sky. Yi Xian suddenly said, Miss Tendo, your name is Moon Yen Yen? Tendo nodded. I named it myself. Does it sound nice? Yi Xian was a little puzzled. Why did you choose such a name? Tendo smiled. If you never forget it, there will be an echo. If you don't forget your original heart, you will be successful from beginning to end. Yi Xian was silent. Tendo smiled. However, I still want you to call me Tendo. Yi Xian was a little puzzled. Why? Tendo smiled mischievously. In human terms, Nian Nian is a maiden name. It's a nickname. Only the people closest to me can call it. Yi Xian asked, do you have any relatives? Tendo nodded. Yes, there are quite a few. Yi Xian looked at Tendo. Where are they? Tendo smiled. I'll bring you to meet them later. Yi Xian nodded. Okay. About an hour later, Tendo stopped. In front of her and Xian was a dead planet. There was no life on that planet. It had been annihilated for many years. Tendo smiled. There used to be some humans here. They were very strong. Then they destroyed this planet themselves. Xian was speechless. Tendo said softly, "When I woke up, I locked them up here and let them kill each other. Don't they like to fight? I let them kill to their heart's content. I told them that only one of them could leave this place alive. They were not convinced and wanted to join forces to beat me. Yes, they shouted something like Tendo was heartless and wanted to defy the heavens. It seems that this group of people was the first to shout that slogan." Xian asked, "And then?" Tendo blinked his eyes and then said with a smile, "With one slash of my sword they all died." Xian was speechless. Tendo looked at the dead planet in front of him and said with a smile, "I killed them, but I kept their souls and then suppressed them all on this planet. I feel that completely killing them is too easy on them. They should pay a painful price for their actions. Therefore I suppressed their souls on this planet and made them accompany this destroyed planet." As she spoke, she looked at Xian and smiled. "Do you think I'm cruel?" Xian looked at Tendo. "Do you care about what I think?" Tendo smiled. "I'm just asking." As she spoke, she opened her palm. "Come." His voice fell. Buzz. A sword sound suddenly resounded on the dead planet. The next moment, a sword light suddenly appeared in the sight of Xian and Tendo. The sword light was like a meteor cutting through the starry sky, and finally landed steadily in Tendo's hand. The sword light dissipated and a sword floated in Tendo's hand. The sword was about 3 feet long and 2 fingers wide. The sword was as smooth as a mirror, as if it was made of jade. On the back of the sword there was the word, heaven, and on the front of the sword there was the word, Tao. Tendo sword. Tendo handed the sword to Xian. "For you." Xian looked at Tendo. "For me for free?" Tendo smiled. "Otherwise." Xian said in a deep voice, "Why?" Tendo placed the Tendo sword in Xian's hand. She smiled. "Because I'm scheming against you. Don't feel bad about it. Think about it. Everything I do has a purpose. Including teaching you the 5 elements extreme physique, helping you cultivate and giving you this sword, there is a purpose. There is a purpose." Xian shook his head and smiled. This woman. At this moment his heart was a little complicated. Tendo glanced at the Tendo sword and said, "The reason why this sword is called Tendo sword is because there is a law I set inside, which is the Tendo law. It can be said that in this universe, if you have this sword, you can break all laws. Any law in this world will be ineffective against you. In addition, you can also use this swordsman to restore it. For example, after space is broken, you can use this sword to restore it instantly. Simply put, holding this sword you can say that you are Tendo." Xian looked at Tendo. "I'm afraid this won't work, right?" Tendo smiled. "You can. The lethality of this sword is actually just that. However, it has some special abilities that your executing heaven sword and soul subduing sword don't have. The simplest is that you can summon the power of heaven and earth to your body when you hold this sword. This universe will help you. However, it's best not to use the power of heaven and earth indiscriminately because it will consume a lot of heaven and earth. In addition, as I said just now, there is the Tendo law. And this Tendo law is not just 1 or 2 but countless. You can slowly experience the benefits in the future." After a moment of silence, Xian put away the Tendo sword and said, "Thank you." Tendo smiled. "No need to thank me. Go. I'll take you to the last place." After saying that, she turned and left. Xian followed. On the way, Xian suddenly asked, "Other than the human race, have you suppressed other races?" Tendo nodded. Many. In fact, no matter what race it is, there are good and bad. Even the human race has many good people." Speaking of this, she turned to look at Xian. "Do you know why I read so many books?" Xian said softly, "Seeking knowledge." Tendo smiled. "That's part of the reason. There's another reason. It's restraint." Xian frowned slightly. He was a little puzzled. Tendo smiled and explained. "Simply put, the stronger a person is, the more self-centered he may be. Indifference. Many very powerful people are very indifferent to life. They don't respect life. Just like those people before. They didn't care about the life and death of the entire planet's living beings for their own selfishness. They destroyed the entire planet." Saying that, she paused and then continued, I need to restrain myself because I'm very powerful. If I didn't restrain myself, I would have already exterminated you humans. Not only you humans but all living beings would be miserable because I'm very powerful. Hehe. Yi Xian looked at Tendo. You read books to restrain yourself? Tendo nodded. Yes. Apart from that, I also need to maintain a clear mind at all times because I'm the Tendo of this universe. If I make a stupid decision, countless living beings will lose their lives. Saying that, she looked at Yi Xian. You should know about the fifth dimension. Do you know why so many powers survived the fifth dimension? Yi Xian stared at Tendo. Your reason. Heavenly Tao smiled and said, yes, let me tell you a secret. I was the one who saved Aluo. I was the one who sent her into the strange beast scripture, allowing her to avoid the fifth dimension tribulation. Of course, she is also very strong. I only helped her a little. Also, the person who created the strange beast scripture was me. Hearing this, Yi Xian's pupils suddenly shrank. Tiandao blinked. Surprised, right? Hehe. I was the one who created the strange beast scripture. Then I placed those strange beasts in the strange beast scripture, allowing them to avoid the calamity. Yi Xian stared at Tendo without saying anything. Tendo lightly patted Yi Xian's shoulder. I like the words you said tonight. Those who should be killed must be killed. Those who shouldn't be killed must not be killed. Saying that, she turned her head and looked around. There was a trace of melancholy in her eyes. I like this universe because I exist because of this universe. Can be said that this universe is my parents. They gave birth to me and raised me. Not only me but all living beings in this universe should feel reverence and gratitude towards this universe. To be honest, I really want to protect this universe. I want to protect it. But, it's easy to destroy but difficult to create. Saying that, she shook her head. There are many problems that cannot be solved with strength. The universe is very simple but the living beings on it are very complicated. Especially humans. Humans are the most complicated. I have studied human nature all my life, but I have not been able to find any results. Human nature? Yi Xian was silent. He did not expect that this Tendo would study human nature. At this moment, Tendo suddenly smiled. Let's go. Saying that, she disappeared not far away. In the starry sky, after a moment of silence, Yi Xian followed. About an hour later, the will of heaven brought Yi Xian to a village. The village was not big and it was a little shabby. Yi Xian looked at the village entrance. There were 3 big words. Tendo Village. Yi Xian looked at Tendo. Tendo smiled and said, I wrote it, he. Just as Yi Xian was about to speak, a little boy suddenly ran out. The little boy was about 3 or 4 years old and was naked. He quickly ran to Tendo. Tendo picked him up and kissed his chubby little face. Little Moo, did you miss me? The little boy said in a clear voice, yes. Tendo laughed and walked into the village with the little boy in her arms. Yi Xian followed. After entering the village, Yi Xian found some people. These people were all ordinary people without any cultivation. When they saw Tendo, they all greeted Tendo. Obviously, they were very familiar with Tendo. At this moment, a farmer's woman suddenly smiled and said, Little Nian, who is this young man beside you? Tendo smiled and was about to speak. Suddenly, the farmer's woman laughed and said, He can't be your man, right? Yi Xian was speechless. Hearing the farmer's words, many people in the field looked at Yi Xian. Everyone spoke one after another. Tendo glanced at Yi Xian and said with a smile, Aunt Ma, is your waist better? The farmer's woman patted her waist and said with a smile, It's completely healed. Tendo smiled and walked away with the little boy in his arms. Yi Xian followed. At this moment, Aunt Ma suddenly ran to Tendo's side. She took Tendo's hand and her eyes fell on Yi Xian. Little Nian, I tell you, you can't find a man just by looking at his appearance. The little brother beside you looks fair and clean, but most of them are good-looking but useless. Let me tell you, when you find a man, you have to find a very hard man, not a soft one. Tendo glanced at a certain part of Yi Xian and said, You mean there? Aunt Ma rolled her eyes at Tendo and said, Definitely there. Otherwise, do you think it's a head? A big head is useless, a small head is hard. Yi Xian was speechless. Chapter 1151. Hearing Auntie Ma's words, Tendo covered her mouth and chuckled. Yi Xian glanced at Auntie Ma and was about to speak when Auntie Ma suddenly said, Little Nian, that nephew of mine is not bad. He's burly, can work, can endure hardship and treats people well. If you were to be with him, you'd be a good person. Tendo blinked and smiled. Let me think about it. Auntie Ma hesitated for a moment before nodding. All right, then think about it. Tendo smiled and placed the little boy in her arms on the ground. She gently rubbed the little boy's head. Go play by yourself. The little boy raised his head and pointed to his face. Kiss. Tendo laughed and leaned over to kiss the little boy. Only then did the little boy leave happily. Tendo led Yi Xian away. Auntie Ma glanced at Yi Xian provocatively. Yi Xian smiled and said, I'm very hard. Being provoked, Auntie Ma suddenly patted her chest and her eyes were filled with contempt. Young man, do you want to try? I'd like to see how hard you are. Yi Xian was speechless. In the distance, Yi Xian fled. This woman was too powerful. Tendo suddenly smiled. Auntie Ma is very powerful. No one in the village is her match in a quarrel. Yi Xian nodded. She's indeed powerful. Tendo said softly, many people here have many small thoughts, but they don't have big evil thoughts. Of course, it's also related to their strength because their strength doesn't allow them to have evil thoughts. However, I also realize that if there's enough benefits or temptation, some honest people will become evil. Saying that, she looked at Yi Xian. I understand a principle here. That is, no one is born evil. Often there's a reason why a person becomes evil. Of course, some people become evil purely because of ambition and desire. Yi Xian looked at Tendo. Miss Tendo, I feel like you're teaching me something along the way. Tendo shook his head. No, I'm just chatting with you. That's all. Just as Yi Xian was about to speak, the Tendo suddenly smiled and said, We're here. Yi Xian looked in front of the Tendo. They were in front of a bamboo house. The Tendo smiled and said, This is my home here. I often come here to sit. After saying that, she pushed the door open and walked in. Yi Xian followed. After entering the bamboo house, Yi Xian was stunned. The bamboo house was filled with ancient books. Furthermore, it was exactly the same as that Yaju. Yi Xian looked at the Tendo. The Tendo smiled and said, Didn't you want to read? After saying that, she pointed at the ancient books in front of her. Feel free to read. Yi Xian nodded. He didn't stand on ceremony and directly walked to the bookshelf. He picked up an ancient book and started reading. These ancient books weren't divine skills or heart sutras. However, in Yi Xian's opinion, these books were probably more precious than divine skills or heart sutras. These were probably collected and written by the Tendo. In addition to the detailed introduction of various powers, there was also the history of the fifth dimension. Especially the ancient book he was reading. This ancient book was called Ancient History. This ancient history recorded the history of the universe from the beginning to the present. All the major events that happened during this period were clearly recorded. At this moment, the entire fifth dimension became clear in Yi Xian's mind. Through this ancient history, Yi Xian discovered that the fifth dimension was divided into a total of 4 eras. The first era was the chaotic era. At that time, the fifth dimension had just appeared. It was chaotic and didn't have any living beings. After the chaotic era was the Tendo era. Tendo also appeared in this era. During the Tendo era, countless living beings appeared in this universe, including humans. During the Tendo era, there was a group of outstanding humans. Among them, there was the human king. The human king belonged to the Tendo era. At that time, humans were very weak. Compared to other powerful races, they didn't have any advantages. It was also at that time that the human race was unprecedentedly united. It was also at that time that human civilization appeared and was protected by the human powerhouses. However, when the fifth dimension calamity arrived, human civilization almost disappeared. Why didn't it disappear? Because the Tendo secretly protected human civilization. The book didn't mention this. This was Yi Xian's guess. This was because the book had a description of the fifth dimension calamity. Under the fifth dimension calamity, all living beings would cease to exist. At that time, it was impossible for humans to resist the fifth dimension calamity. In the entire fifth dimension, only the Tendo had the ability to save people under the fifth dimension calamity. During the Tendo era, some people had to be mentioned. They were the righteous gods, people like Tai Yi and the others. However, the ancient history didn't mention much about them. After the Tendo era was the God and Devil era. The God and Devil era was the era of ancestor Amu. At that time, countless powerhouses appeared. These people were extremely powerful enough to call themselves gods. The people on the planet that the Tendo sword suppressed were also from the God and Devil era. During that era, many people shouted the slogan, "Tendo is heartless and goes against the heavens." This was because the people of that era believed that the fifth dimension calamity was caused by the Tendo. The final result was that all the so-called God and Devil era experts of that era were destroyed. However, the human civilization was still passed down. After the God and Devil era was the ancient era. However, the spiritual energy of the fifth dimension was no longer the same as before. Therefore, no particularly powerful powerhouses appeared in the ancient era. After the ancient era was the Cambrian era. During this era, a person appeared that caught the attention of the Tendo era. Arrow. Regarding Arrow, the Tendo era gave an evaluation. A mortal body unprecedented. In the entire Cambrian era, only Arrow was recorded in the annals of history. As for the Chalk era, which was also the era of the strange beast scripture, there were no powerful powerhouses. If not for the Tendo era, that era would have been completely erased by the fifth dimension calamity. After the ancient era was the modern era. In this modern era, an extraordinary person appeared, and that person was the prophet. However, in the eyes of the Tendo era, the prophet was an outsider. Just like the plain-clothed woman, they were both outsiders. As for the plain-clothed woman, the Tendo era gave her a definition: dangerous. There was only one word to describe it. As for the green-clothed man, the prophet gave her a definition: the fortune of the fifth dimension. That year, that man with his sword alone made millions upon millions of specters not dare to take a step forward. Soon Zhou Xian turned to the last page. When he saw the last page, he was stunned. The last page only had 2 words: Zhou Xian. Himself. Zhou Xian was a bit confused. He raised his head and looked across, but the Tendo was no longer there. Zhou Xian walked out of the bamboo house. At this moment, the Tendo era was sitting on a small stone not far from the bamboo house. She was holding a big bowl in her hand. The big bowl was filled with white rice and messy vegetables. She was eating with relish, but the corners of her mouth were covered with oil and rice grains. She had no image at all. Zhou Xian walked to the side of the Tendo. The Tendo glanced at him and said with a smile, "Do you want to eat? Aunt Ma made it for me." Zhou Xian smiled and said, "She probably wants you to marry her nephew." The Tendo laughed and said, "Actually, her nephew is not bad. It's just that he is too honest, so he can't find a wife." Zhou Xian was a bit puzzled. Can't he find a wife because he is honest? The Tendo shook her head and sighed. She wiped the rice grains from the corner of her mouth and said, "An honest man marry a wife? What are you thinking? Haven't you heard of a saying? Women don't like bad men. I have also studied it. Let me tell you, many women are very strange." "Why is that?" "Because I found that most women like bad men. In the secular world, bad men often have many women. On the contrary, honest men have no luck with women." Zhou Xian frowned slightly. "Just because they are honest?" The Tendo smiled and said, "Yes. However, there is an even more strange phenomenon. That is, after those bad women are heartbroken, they will find an honest man to marry." As she said, she looked at Zhou Xian. "To be honest, many honest men have green heads, he." Zhou Xian was speechless. At this moment, the Tendo said, "Of course, not all women are very realistic. Some honest men look honest on the surface, but they are not honest at all. The reason why they are honest is because they have no ability. I have carefully observed 1 or 2 honest men. After they become successful, they are even more unrestrained than those fickle men. Therefore, it has been proven that whether a man is bad or not is often related to his own strength. Of course, there are many men and women who are good. However, if they meet the wrong person at the wrong time, they will be very tragic. Fate is a very mysterious thing." Zhou Xian said in a deep voice, "What is fate?" The Tendo fiercely ate 2 mouthfuls of rice and said, "Fate is a very mysterious thing. It can't be explained in a few words. However, I think that everyone has the opportunity to change their fate. Those who work hard will not be too bad. Take the matter between men and women, for example. In the secular world, if a man has money, he will have fate with any woman. It is the same in our martial arts world. Those who are strong will not lack women." Zhou Xian looked at the Tendo. "Did you study these things when you had nothing to do?" The Tendo smiled and said, "I like to study many things. I think it is quite interesting." Zhou Xian pointed at himself and said, "Am I an honest man?" The Tendo blinked and said, Are you an honest man? Xian asked. Am I not? I don't do anything stupid. The Tendo smiled and said, as long as you are a fickle man, you will have a special characteristic. Do you know what it is? Xian asked. What? The Tendo smiled and said, thick skin. Some are even more powerful. They are simply shameless. Xian's skin is thicker than the barrier of the universe. Oh, you are shameless. Xian was speechless. The Tendo put the bowl in front of him, then got up and walked to Xian. What do you want from me? Xian handed the ancient history book to Xian. The last page only has my name. What does this mean? The Tendo smiled and said, it means that what happens next is written by you. Xian frowned slightly. What do you mean? You don't want to write anymore? The Tendo blinked. She looked at Xian and the corners of her mouth raised slightly. I tell you, I want to plot against you. Are you afraid? Xian was speechless. Chapter 1152. Looking at the woman in front of him, Xian had mixed feelings. He could not see through this woman. This woman had helped him a lot, but she also told him that she had a purpose. Of course, he also knew that she definitely had a purpose. Why would she help him for no reason? Could not be because he was handsome, right? At this moment, Tendo suddenly laughed. There's not much time left. Just focus on your book. Xian frowned. Not much time? What do you mean? Tendo looked at Tendo. What do you think? Xian said in a deep voice. The upper realm. Tendao smiled and said, I've bought some time for you. However, I've only bought you some time. As a price, I'll make them do things that they might not have wanted to do in the first place. Simply put, what's coming next is the real storm. Saying that, she got up and lightly patted Xian's shoulder. 3 days later, you will leave this place. Xian looked at Tendo. What about you? Tendo laughed. I will also leave, but the place I am going to is different from you, and the things I need to do are also different. Xian said in a deep voice. You won't be leaving the 5th dimension, right? Tendo shook her head. I have been here with you for too long, you know, I have a lot of things to do. Don't ask about other things, just focus on your book. Xian looked at Tendo and nodded. All right. Saying that, he turned and walked into the bamboo house. Reading. 3 days later, Xian left the house, but Tendo was not outside the bamboo house. Xian walked out of the bamboo house. It was early in the morning and in the village, smoke was curling up from the chimneys. Many villagers were already busy. At the entrance of the village, Xian saw Tendo. Tendo was sitting on a rock, her hands were folded on her knees, and her eyes were slightly closed as if she was cultivating. Xian walked behind the Tendo and did not disturb the Tendo. About an hour later, Tendo opened her eyes. She looked at Xian and smiled. I wanted to leave, but after thinking about it, I think it's better to say goodbye. Xian looked at Tendo. We'll meet again, right? Tendo smirked. That's not necessarily true. I'm not sure if you'll survive. After a moment of silence, Xian bowed slightly. Thank you for helping me a lot. The Tendo looked at Xian and said with smile. I am scheming against you. Xian smiled and said, maybe. But I still want to thank you for helping me a lot. Perhaps we will become enemies in the future, but right now I sincerely thank you for the help you have given me these past few days. Tendo smiled. Good luck to all of us. After saying that, she turned and left. Xian looked at Tendo. At this moment, Tendo suddenly turned her head and said with a smile, remember to come to this place more often in the future. I'll leave the study room for you. When you have nothing to do, come here and take a look. Xian nodded. I will. Tendo waved her hand and the next moment she disappeared. She left. In the field, Xian was silent. He had to admit that he had benefited a lot from interacting with Tendo for the past few days. She was a very impressive woman. After a moment of silence, Xian left. In the starry sky, Tendo walked slowly. She looked very happy, jumping up and down like a little girl. At this moment, the space not far in front of her suddenly split open, and then a middle-aged man walked out. The middle-aged man had long hair and held a black folding fan in his right hand. The middle-aged man cupped his fists at Tendo. Your Excellency Tendo. Tendo looked at the middle-aged man and said with a smile, you are from the 6th dimension. The middle-aged man nodded. 6th dimension martial arts hall envoy you by. Tendo smiled. You are also here for the study room? The middle-aged man nodded. We are here for the study room, but we have no ill intentions towards this world. Tendo blinked. You should go find Yi Xian. Yubai laughed lightly and said, yes, but we came here, we have to greet Miss Tiandao first. The hall master has instructed us not to be rude to Miss Tendo. Tendo smiled. The upper realm seems to have joined forces with the spirits of dark ones. Yubai nodded. Yes, they have joined forces. Tendo smiled. Aren't you going to stop them? From what I know, once those spirits of dark ones go to the 6th dimension, you will have a headache, right? Yubai looked at Tendo. Your Excellency Tendo, what if they come to the 5th dimension? Tendo blinked. We have the sword sect. They can't come over. Sword sect. Yubai was silent. Regarding this mysterious force, the 6th dimension naturally had some understanding. To be able to stop the spirits of dark ones, this sword sect was not an ordinary terrifying force. Tendo smiled. You should understand one thing. The upper realm's target is your 6th dimension, not our 5th dimension. Yubai smiled. So this time we are here to cooperate with you. Tendo nodded. Tell me about it. Yubai looked at Tendo. Miss Tendo, we all know that you want to protect the 5th dimension. As for us, we do not have any ill intentions towards the 5th dimension. We want to cooperate with you. If you help us seize the study room, we will help you deal with the upper realm. Tendo shook her head. No. Yubai frowned. Why? Tendo sighed. You have to understand that the upper realm does not have any ill intentions towards me. Yubai said. But the spirits of dark ones do. If the spirits of dark ones want to go to the 6th dimension, they must pass through the 5th dimension. If they reach the 5th dimension, will the 5th dimension still exist? Tendo smiled. I said it. We have the sword sect. Yubai looked at Tendo. Tendo smiled. If I help you seize the study room, I will offend Yi Xian. Offending Yi Xian is equivalent to offending the sword sect. Why should I do that? As for helping me deal with the upper realm, forgive me for being blunt. The upper realm's target is your 6th dimension. Their target is not me. To put it simply, I do not need your help. Yubai was silent. Tendo suddenly smiled. I have an idea for cooperation. Do you want to hear it? Yubai looked at Tendo. What idea? Tendo smiled. Actually, if I am not wrong, your idea is to let Yi Xian fight the upper realm and the spirits of dark ones to the death. Then you will come out and take advantage of it. Because whether it is Yi Xian or the upper realm or the spirits of dark ones or the sword sect, they are all threats to you. You should be the happiest when they kill each other. But what are you afraid of? Of the study room. Yubai looked at Tendo. Why should we be afraid of the study room? Tendo smiled. The study room is definitely a fatal threat to the 6th dimension. Otherwise, the upper realm would not have gone crazy to seize the study room. Once the study room falls into the hands of the spirits of dark ones or the upper realm, it will be devastating for the 6th dimension. Am I right? Yubai was silent. Tendo continued. The reason you appeared is because you think Yi Xian has no chance of winning, am I right? Yubai nodded. Tendo smiled. Why do you think so? Yubai said softly, the sword sect cannot stop the spirits of dark ones. Tendo looked at Yubai. After a while she said, the spirits of dark ones also have external help. Yubai nodded. They have been suppressed by the sword sect for too many years. They have learned to change. They are not as arrogant as before. Not long after, the sword realm will change. Once the sword sect cannot stop them, the 5th dimension will be destroyed in an instant. Then he looked at Tendo. Your Excellency Tendo, I will not beat around the bush. We do not have the ability to protect the 5th dimension. However, we have the ability to protect you. If you are willing, you can follow us to the 6th dimension. Tendo suddenly smiled. Let's talk about the study room. You want to be the first to obtain the study room before the spirits of dark ones. Yubai nodded. That study room cannot fall into the hands of the spirits of dark ones. Tendo smiled. However, you are a bit afraid. Because you do not want to fight against Yi Xian directly. After all, this is not your territory. You do not have the ability to kill him in this world. Therefore you're looking for me. I want to go to the 6th dimension. As a condition, I must bring the study room with me, right? Yubai looked at Tendo. Yes. Tendo shook her head. Too late. Hearing this, Yubai frowned. What do you mean? Tendo looked at Yubai and said seriously, I am telling you, Yi Xian can already open the study room. Hearing this, Yubai's pupils shrank. He slowly clenched his fists. Tendo looked at Yubai. You have forgotten one possibility. What if Xian joins hands with the spirits of dark ones from the upper realm? Yubai clenched his fists even tighter. Tendo chuckled. The fifth dimension disaster is coming. If you want to live, what is the best way? Of course, it is to take refuge in the sixth dimension. The upper realm's goal is the sixth dimension. The spirits of dark one's ultimate goal is also the sixth dimension. If Xian and his friends want to live, they can only go to the sixth dimension. Under such circumstances, why can't they join hands? Yubai was silent. His face did not look good. This was what they were worried about. Therefore they could not help but come forward and look for Tendo to cooperate. Tendo smiled. Let me tell you. You only have one way to go. That is to help Xian. Let him have enough power to fight against the upper realm and the spirits of Dark One. Because once he feels that he cannot resist, he might surrender. And the upper realm and the spirits of Dark One will definitely not fight him to the death. Because behind him is Arrow, the sword sect, Xiao Dao, and that mysterious woman in plain dress. Therefore once Xian admits defeat, your sixth dimension is finished. Yubai looked at Xian. Will he admit defeat? Tian Dao sighed softly. Why not? Because if he admits defeat, everyone can join hands to attack the sixth dimension. Isn't that good? In other words, as long as he hands over the study house and does nothing, the sixth dimension and the upper realm will fight you to the death. Then he can reap the benefits. Yubai was silent. This was what they were worried about. Tendo walked in front of Yubai and said seriously, now that you are plotting against his study house, it is the same as forcing him to stand opposite of you. You can help him and join hands with him to fight against the upper realm and the spirits of Dark One. This is the most beneficial for you. What do you say? Yubai was silent for a moment. Miss Tendo is right. However, I cannot make the decision. Tendo smiled. You can go back and talk to them. Yubai suddenly smiled. Miss Tendo, we still have another choice. Tendo asked. What choice? Yubai smiled. That plain-dressed woman has already arrived at our world. Tendo blinked. What's wrong? Yubai looked at Tendo and smiled. I heard that her relationship with Xian is not bad. Tendo nodded. Yes. Yubai smiled. If we capture that plain-dressed woman and use her to threaten Xian, do you think Xian will take the initiative to hand over the study house? Heavenly Axiom blinked. At this moment she was speechless. Yubai smiled. I think this method is feasible. What do you think? With that he laughed loudly. Then he turned around and disappeared into the horizon. In the field. Tendo was silent for a moment. I really don't understand your operation. P.S. Overworked and woke up late. Chapter 1153. In the Worldwide Academy. In a courtyard, Xian and the female teacher sat opposite each other. The female teacher looked at Xian with a complicated look in her eyes. The man in front of her was much stronger than before. Xian looked at the female teacher. Teacher, I want everyone in the Worldwide Academy to go to the Wu clan. The female teacher was silent. She naturally knew what Xian meant. The academy and Fu Wenzong had a close relationship with Xian. If the people of the upper realm could not do anything to Xian, they would definitely think of ways to deal with them. After a moment, the female teacher nodded. All right. Xian got up and was about to leave when the teacher suddenly said, Sir, are you from the upper realm? Xian nodded. From the looks of it, he should be. However, I can't be sure if he is from the sixth dimension. The teacher nodded. I understand. Xian disappeared into the distance. The female teacher looked at the sword gleam in the sky, which was getting dimmer and dimmer. No one knew what she was thinking. After Xian left the Worldwide Academy, he went to Fu Wenzong. Soon, Fu Wenzong led the sect to Shaman City. Shaman City. Xian and Amu came to the grave. And Lanxiu and the others were still in the grave. Xian looked at Amu. How much longer do they need? Amu shook his head. I don't know. Xian was silent. Amu smiled. Don't worry. They are extremely talented and have a strong foundation. There won't be any problems. Xian nodded. He was very confident in the girls. Amu suddenly said, What are your plans next? Xian looked at Amu and smiled. You have an idea? Amu nodded. Xian said, Tell me. Amu said softly, The strongest battle prowess on our side now is Arrow and Xiao Dao. Apart from the two of them, the rest are still far from the higher realm's strength. In other words, if the other side holds up Arrow and Xiao Dao and then sends out 10 Shattering Void Tier elites, we'll be completely defeated. 10 Shattering Void Tier elites. Xian was silent. Although they had many Sovereign Tier elites on their side, only Xiao Dao and Arrow were in the Shattering Void Tier. It could be said that as long as Xiao Dao and Arrow were pinned down, the situation on their side would become very unfavorable. Mu continued. There are two reasons why the higher-ups haven't attacked with all their might. Firstly, they're temporarily unable to send all of them down. The second reason is that they're worried. They're worried about the woman in a plain dress behind you and the sword sect. Xian nodded. Continue. Mu said gravely, what I'm most worried about now is that the woman in the plain dress has completely left the higher realm, and they'll think of a way to hold up Arrow and Xiao Dao and then hold up the sword sect. In this situation, the situation is very unfavorable for us. As she spoke, she looked at Xian. There's one more person, Tendo. From the current situation, her goal is to make you fight to the death with the higher realm, and then she'll come out to take advantage. Xian shook his head. It might not be that simple. Mu said, how so? Xian said softly, I can't see through her and can't guess what she wants to do. But my intuition tells me that she won't be our enemy in the short term. Mu was silent for a moment and said, fine, eliminate her first. Then our real enemies now are the higher realm and the dark spirit race. But we know nothing about them. To put it simply, we're too passive. Xian said abruptly, Old Gu. As soon as he spoke, a sword ray suddenly landed beside him. It was Old Gu. Old Gu glanced at Xian and a trace of surprise flashed in his eyes. But soon a smile appeared on his face. He could feel that his young sect leader had improved again. Xian looked at Old Gu. Old Gu, can you tell me about the dark spirit race? Hearing this, Old Gu's expression gradually became solemn. Seeing this, Mu's face gradually sank. After a moment, Old Gu said softly, the dark spirit race is very strong. Very strong. Xian nodded. Can the sword sect stop them? A trace of arrogance flashed in Old Gu's eyes. If they fight us head-on, then our sword sect isn't afraid of them. But if they retreat to the dark spirit world, then we can't do anything. The dark spirit world is extremely complicated because there isn't any spiritual energy in it. Our sword sect swordsmen can't stay for too long after entering it. The lack of spiritual energy doesn't affect them, but it greatly affects us. Moreover, it's filled with boundless yin energy and the aura of death. Once we enter it, we have to use our own sword chi and sword intent to resist the aura of death and yin energy. Under such circumstances, not only will we consume a lot of energy, but our combat strength will be greatly reduced as well. So, we can only guard it all these years and can't annihilate them. Mu said abruptly, the sword sect leader should have the strength to annihilate them all those years ago, right? Old Gu spoke proudly, of course. With the sect leader's strength, not to mention annihilating a single dark spirit, even 100 dark spirits are nothing to worry about. In fact, when he discovered the dark spirit, he was prepared to annihilate them completely because this race was too terrifying. There are two reasons why he didn't completely annihilate the dark spirit at that time. The first reason is that at that time, countless dark spirit super elites paid the price of self-detonation to forcibly hold him back, allowing countless dark spirits to retreat to the dark spirit world. At this point, his expression suddenly became solemn, and then he said, this race is actually very united, terrifyingly united. At that time, when they discovered that they couldn't defeat the sect leader, the leader of the dark spirit race of that generation, in order to protect the dark spirit race's retreat, led hundreds of return to origin break world elites, nearly 300 peak stage shattering void tier elites, and tens of thousands of dark spirit death warriors to explode crazily. With so many elites exploding themselves, although the sect leader wasn't afraid, he had no choice but to resist, because if he didn't, these forces would be enough to destroy the entire fifth dimension. Mu suddenly said in a deep voice, is your sect leader at the self-release tier? Old Gu glanced at Mu and shook his head. I don't know. The sect leader's strength at that time is a mystery. Mu was silent. Actually, at this moment she was still very shocked. Two shocks. The first shock was the dark spirit race. This race actually had so many return to origin break world elites, More than 100 of them. What kind of concept was that? If there were 5 of them now, they would probably be able to sweep away many forces in the 5th dimension. Apart from that, there were also more than 300 peak stage shattering void tier elites. What kind of race was this? Of course, there was even more shocking news. The Sword sect leader killed them all by himself. At this time, Old Gu said, actually at that time the sect leader still had the ability to annihilate the dark spirit race. However, for some unknown reason the sect leader left in a hurry, very hurry. He only left behind a sentence before leaving. Xian asked, what sentence? Old Gu said in a deep voice. Before the sect leader left, he used his name to summon all the disciples of the Sword sect in the whole 5th dimension to head to the Sword realm to stand guard. He left in a hurry. Xian and Amu looked at each other. What could have made the Sword sect leader leave in such a hurry? At this time Old Gu said again, young sect leader, that woman in a plain dress. Xian looked at Old Gu. What about her? Old Gu smiled bitterly. That woman is very scary. Xian asked, what do you mean? I think she's quite good. Old Gu shook his head and smiled bitterly. How is she good? Young sect leader, you don't know she. As he spoke, he looked at the horizon as if afraid of something and then shook his head. Forget it. Let's not talk about her. Xian. At this time Amu suddenly said, Old Gu, so many years have passed and the dark spirit race never thought of coming out? What I mean is, have they ever attacked the Sword realm on a large scale? Old Gu thought for a moment and then said, they haven't attacked the Sword realm on a large scale, but they would occasionally harass us. Hearing this, Amu's expression darkened. Old Gu looked at Amu. What's wrong? Amu said in a low voice, there are 2 possibilities. Firstly, they were heavily injured by the Sword sect leader, and their vitality was greatly damaged, so they're unable to come out. Secondly, they're recuperating and developing continuously. Old Gu's expression darkened as well. Amu said softly, the Sword sect is very strong, but the Sword sect has very few members. As she spoke up to this point, she looked at Xian. The situation isn't very good. Especially now, it's very likely that the upper realm has joined forces with the dark spirit race. Right at this moment, a ray of light suddenly appeared before Old Gu. In next to no time, the ray of light dispersed, and a voice entered the space between Old Gu's brows. Moments later, Old Gu's expression darkened. Xian asked, what's wrong? Old Gu looked at Xian. Young sect leader, I have to return to the Sword sect. Xian frowned slightly. Did something happen to the Sword sect? Old Gu nodded with an unsightly expression. The sword formation that our Sword sect set up before the dark spirit world has been destroyed. Young sect leader, you might not know this, but this formation was personally set up by Senior Sister Lu to seal the dark spirit world. Otherwise, the spirits of the dark spirit world would be able to escape. Now that the sword formation has been destroyed, it means that the spirits of the dark spirit race might be able to escape. The Sword sect doesn't have enough manpower now, so I have to return. Xian said in a low voice, how was the sword formation destroyed? Old Gu shook his head. I don't know. An expert might have appeared among the dark spirit race. Xian said abruptly, I'll go to the sword world with you. Old Gu hesitated for a moment and said, young sect leader, what about this place? Xian said in a low voice, Arrow and Xiao Dao are here. There won't be much of a problem for now. Old Gu nodded. All right. Let's go now. Xian looked at Amu. I'll leave this place to you. Contact me immediately if anything happens. Amu nodded. Be careful. Xian nodded. Take care. As soon as he finished speaking, he and Old Gu transformed into a ray of light and vanished into the horizon. Xian didn't leave right away. Instead, he went to the graveyard. Before the graveyard, Yiling still hadn't come out. Xian gazed at the graveyard for a very long time before he turned around and left. Not long after Xian left, the graveyard suddenly trembled. Somewhere in the distant starry sky, Tendo stopped abruptly. She turned around and saw a person standing over 30 m away from her. Tendo smiled. You're here so soon. The person smiled. You don't have to die. However, the starry sky is the boundary. You have to stay here and can't leave. In this way I won't kill you. What do you say? Tendo raised her hands. Fine. Whatever you say. I surrender. The person looked at Tendo with a smile on his face. He didn't say anything. Tendo smiled. Once I die, some people will be on their guard. That little guy is timid. Once he finds out that I'm dead, he'll definitely know that things are not good. At that time, if he calls someone over, for example the sword sect leader. Hee. The person turned around and left. At the same time a voice came from afar. Your Excellency Tendo, from now on, don't let me know that you're meddling in the affairs of the fifth dimension. Don't plot anything. Otherwise your big head will be separated from your neck. As the voice faded, the person disappeared completely. In the field, Tendo shook her head and smiled. Her smile was calm and composed. FPW. Chapter 1154. Xian and Old Gu were flying through the starry sky on their swords. They were heading towards the sword region. Old Gu spoke abruptly. Young sect master, are you able to contact the sect master? The green-clothed man? Xian shook his head. I can't. Old Gu fell silent. Xian gazed at him. What's wrong? Old Gu spoke softly. I'm afraid it's not that simple this time. Xian was about to speak when he suddenly lowered his head. A moment later he and Old Gu had vanished amidst the starry sky. It didn't take long for Xian and Old Gu to appear before an ancient city. At this moment, shrill cries resounded incessantly from within the ancient city while countless strands of black energy floated through the sky. Old Gu spoke in a low voice. Yin spirit. As soon as he finished speaking, he took a step forward, and a sword suddenly flew out from behind him. A ray of sword light tore through the sky and slashed into the ancient city. Bang! Suddenly, a powerful force shot into the sky from within the ancient city, and the ray of sword light was instantly shattered. After that, a figure suddenly appeared before Xian and Old Gu. Xian frowned. The Yin spirit looked exactly like a human, but it emanated dense Yin energy and death energy. That was the only thing that was different from humans. As if he knew the question in Xian's heart, Old Gu spoke abruptly. They can take the appearance of anyone they devour. Suddenly the Yin spirit took a deep glance at Xian, and then he turned around and fled. Obviously he'd sensed danger. At the instant the Yin spirit fled, Old Gu was about to attack. However, a ray of white light suddenly flashed and then the Yin spirit was blasted into pieces. Xian and Old Gu turned around and saw a woman walking over slowly from afar. She wore a white embroidered robe, had shoulder-length hair and a red mole between her brows. She seemed proud like a plum blossom in the snow. Her eyes were clear like water and it seemed like she could see through everything. She walked over slowly to Old Gu and Xian and then she grinned. Are both of you from the sword sect? Xian nodded. And you are? The woman laughed and said, Bai Yin. Xian nodded slightly. Lady Han is quite strong. The woman looked at Xian and said with a smile, Young master, ye must be joking. Xian looked at Wu Yin. You know me. Gui laughed sinisterly. In the five-dimensional universe, who doesn't know about young master Yi? Xian was just about to speak when the gate to the ancient city in the distance suddenly cracked open, and then countless people charged out. When he saw these people, Xian's face immediately darkened. These people in front of him were no longer human. These people's entire bodies were pitch black and they had hideous expressions. Their entire bodies emitted a dense aura of death and Yin Qi. Obviously they had become members of the spirit of Yin. Xian and Old Man Gu's faces darkened when they saw that. The dark spirits were too terrifying. Because once they came into contact with them, there was a possibility that they would become one of them. This kind of ability was too overpowered. In the city, countless people charged out, densely packed together. At this moment, Gui Yin suddenly said, If we let them go to other places, the people there will become dark spirits. As she spoke, she looked at Xian and Old Man Gu. Old Man Gu looked at Xian. Xian looked at those people. Can they be saved? Old Man Gu shook his head. Xian nodded. Kill. Old Man Gu turned into a sword ray and charged out. Looking at the densely packed crowd of dark spirits in the distance, Xian was silent. At this moment he finally felt how terrifying the dark spirits were. At this moment Gui Yin suddenly said, Young Master Yi, do you know much about the dark spirits? Xian shook his head. Not much. Gui Yin was silent. Xian asked, Why? Do you know much about them? Guiying gently combed her hair that was messed up by the wind and said softly, I killed a dark spirit before. They have a special characteristic, which is that they can devour. They can also assimilate. If they choose to devour, they will become stronger. If they choose to assimilate, whoever they attack, be it human or spirit, will become one of them. As she spoke, she looked at Zhou Xian. They will devour the powerful and assimilate the weaker ones. Zhou Xian suddenly said, Miss Guiying, it's not a coincidence that we met, right? Guiying smiled. Young Master Yi is very cautious. Zhou Xian smiled. I'm just asking. Guiying looked at Zhou Xian and smiled. It's a coincidence. Zhou Xian nodded. At this moment, Old Man Gu appeared beside Zhou Xian. Zhou Xian said softly, Let's go. Old Man Gu nodded. He glanced at Guiying and was about to leave with Zhou Xian. At this moment, dozens of powerful auras suddenly appeared in the distant sky. Old Man Gu's expression changed drastically. They're Yin spirits, and they're powerful Yin spirits. Why are there so many powerful Yin spirits here? Zhou Xian said softly, Are they coming for us? Meanwhile, Guiying spoke abruptly, I don't think so. It's probably because I killed that dark spirit earlier. As soon as she finished speaking, over 10 powerful Yin spirits had appeared in front of them. The Yin spirit in the lead stared fixedly at Guiying. You killed him? Guiying laughed. Yes. The Yin spirit's expression instantly became ferocious. How dare you? As soon as he finished speaking, he charged towards Guiying. Guiying's expression was calm. She waved her hand lightly and a ray of white light surged out. Right at this moment, a terrifying ray of black light surged out from the Yin spirit, and the ray of white light was instantly devoured by the black light. Guiying's expression changed and she retreated. Suddenly, a ray of light slashed against the black light. Bang! The black light vanished in an instant. Meanwhile, the group of Yin spirits gazed at Zhou Xian and Old Man Gu. The Yin spirit in the lead stared fixedly at Zhou Xian. Swordsman. Zhou Xian nodded. Yes. The Yin spirit suddenly roared furiously. In the next moment, he and the other Yin spirits by his side charged directly at Zhou Xian. Zhou Xian opened his palm and then the executing heaven sword slashed out. The Yin spirit in the lead didn't even have the chance to react before he was slashed into pieces by the executing heaven sword. The other Yin spirits were stunned for a moment when they witnessed this scene, and then they turned around and fled. Old Man Gu was just about to attack when Zhou Xian suddenly said, Something's off. Old Man Gu gazed at Zhou Xian. Zhou Xian spoke in a low voice, What's wrong? As he spoke, he looked directly at Guiying and Guiying laughed. What? Zhou Xian didn't waste his breath at all and he just drew his sword and slashed. He didn't hold back at all with this slash. Old Man Gu was stunned when he saw Zhou Xian suddenly attack. What's going on? The sound of space being torn apart resounded. Zhou Xian's attack missed. At this moment Guiying was over 100 m away. She still had a faint smile on her face and she seemed very composed. Zhou Xian gazed at Guiying. Let me guess. You're from the spirit clan of Yin. Guiying laughed. Young Master Yi is smart as expected. That's right, I'm from the spirit clan of Yin. Zhou Xian smiled. You've come to kill me? Guiying gazed at Zhou Xian. No, I just want to see you. Zhou Xian frowned slightly. See me? Guiying nodded. Yes. Of course, there's one more thing. I want to confirm something. Zhou Xian smiled. What is it? Guiying gazed at Zhou Xian. I want to confirm your bloodline. Zhou Xian stared at Guiying. My bloodline has something to do with you? Guiying smiled. Of course it has something to do with you. You have to repay some people's debts. Zhou Xian walked towards Guiying with his sword in hand. Can you explain it more clearly? Guiying looked at Zhou Xian. The blood feud of my spirit clan's tens of millions of ancestors. You have to repay it with your blood. Zhou Xian stopped and frowned. Did you find the wrong person? Guiying didn't speak again. She and the Yin spirits around her gradually became illusory. Zhou Xian slashed out with his sword. A ray of sword light pierced through the air, but this sword slashed empty air. Guiying and the other Yin spirits had already disappeared. Zhou Xian was silent. Blood feud? He had a blood feud with the spirit clan of Yin? No. Guiying said that Zhou Xian had to repay some people's debts. What's that? Zhou Xian was bewildered. Who had to repay a blood debt? Meanwhile, old Gu suddenly said, I know what she means. Yi Xian gazed at Old Gu and Old Gu said softly, I almost forgot about this. Yi Xian was slightly puzzled. Old Gu, please enlighten me. Old Gu looked at Yi Xian. The blood feud of the tens of millions of spirit clans' ancestors she spoke of refers to what the sect master did all those years ago. Yi Xian was stunned and then he said, then she should look for the sect master of the sword sect. Old Gu shook his head. The sect master isn't in this world. Yi Xian was still puzzled. Then she should look for me? That doesn't make sense. Old Gu hesitated for a moment and then he said, don't you have the sect master's inheritance? That should be the reason. Yi Xian was speechless. Old Gu spoke in a low voice. No matter what, you must be careful, young sect master. Since the sect master isn't in this world, they'll definitely take revenge on you. As he spoke, he gazed at Yi Xian. You might not know this, but the ancestors of the spirit clan swore a blood oath that they would never enter the cycle of reincarnation if their descendants don't avenge them. Yi Xian's eyelids twitched. They're that ruthless? Old Gu nodded. The sect master stopped them all those years ago and killed too many of them. If the sect master hadn't been busy with something during that battle, he would probably have been able to annihilate all the spirit clan members. Now that he isn't here, the spirit clan will definitely come looking for you if they want to take revenge. You have to return to the sword sect with me. Only there will you be safe. Yi Xian's face darkened. I seem to be quite unlucky. I have to take the blame for what the sect master of the sword sect did. Isn't this a trap? Old Gu suddenly said, young sect master, let's go. Yi Xian nodded. Soon the two of them turned into two sword lights and soared into the sky. In the blink of an eye, they disappeared into the horizon. Boundless underground city. Tendo pawn shop. On this day, a person suddenly walked into the pawn shop. Xiao Dao, who was sitting behind the counter, suddenly raised her head. She opened her palms and two blood-red sickles appeared in her hands. Right at this moment, that person smiled. Young miss of the Diabolism clan that dominates the 3,000 great worlds, how are you? Xiao Dao stared at that person. You guys are very capable. You even managed to investigate my background. That person sat in front of Xiao Dao and smiled sweetly. Young miss, if you were at your peak, I would be wary of you. But now, if you don't want to die, it's best that you don't make a move. Xiao Dao's eyes gradually turned cold. Are you threatening me? That person looked at Xiao Dao and smiled. You can think of it that way. Also, I hope you understand that not killing you is giving the Diabolism clan face, not giving you face. You haven't recovered yet, so you don't have the qualifications for me to give you face. Xiao Dao was silent. That person said again, from now on, I don't want to see you leave this room. I also don't want to see you contact Yi Xian. Otherwise, young Miss Xiao Dao, you will definitely die. You should understand your current situation. The current you is not my opponent. Xiao Dao looked at that person. Your target is him. That person nodded and smiled. Of course it's him. The son will pay his father's debt. Xiao Dao smiled. If you go find him now, he will definitely not be your opponent. That person smiled and said nothing. Xiao Dao's smile suddenly disappeared. You wait. That person smiled and said softly, that woman is about to leave the sixth dimension. After saying that, she stood up and left. Chapter 1155. In the pawn shop, Xiao Dao was silent. That woman was about to leave. That woman was naturally the plain-dressed woman. She was waiting for the plain-dressed woman to leave. Xiao Dao raised her head and frowned deeply. She suddenly realized that she had greatly underestimated the spirits of Dark Ones. Without the leader of the Sword Sect, could the Sword Sect stop the spirits of Dark Ones? Could they? Originally, she believed in the Sword Sect. Because that group of swordsmen was too terrifying. Not to mention in the fifth dimension, even in the place where she came from, they were a top force. However, after seeing that woman, she was a little shaken. Originally, she thought that Era was the most monstrous person in this era. But now, it seemed like that was not the case. At the same time, she also realized that her innate talent was not much. Xiao Dao smiled bitterly. As the old saying goes, there is always someone better than you. You think that you are monstrous, but you don't know that there is someone even more monstrous than you. At this moment, there was still a trace of sorrow in her heart. Because she knew that the reason she was still alive was not because of her family, but because of that plain-dressed woman. If it were not for that woman, she would have been dead. Wasteland Country. On this day, Arrow, who was sitting cross-legged in her room, suddenly opened her eyes. The next moment she turned into a sword light and soared into the sky. Soon she arrived in the sky above the wasteland country. Opposite her stood a woman. The woman looked like she was in her 20s. She wore a simple hemp gown with a ribbon tied around her waist. This made her slender figure look even more graceful. Her beautiful hair was tied up with a ribbon. She looked very neat and tidy. From her appearance she was very, very ordinary. When he saw this woman, Luo's brows instantly furrowed. The woman looked at Arrow and smiled. "Your Excellency Arrow, you will definitely not agree to what I want to say. So you can use your sword now. I will only give you one chance." Without any hesitation, the sword in Arrow's right hand suddenly flew up. In the sky, a sword light like a meteor slashed towards the woman. Wherever the sword passed, space exploded inch by inch and was directly annihilated. And when the sword fell, Luo's pupils suddenly shrank. The eternal sword was caught between two fingers. The woman's two fingers caught Arrow's sword. Two of the woman's fingers suddenly loosened, and the eternal sword flew back to Arrow. The woman looked at Arrow, smiled and said, "This is not your strongest sword. Because you're someone I admire, I'll give you another chance." Arrow grabbed the immortal sword and slashed it across his throat. In the blink of an eye, Arrow's body became illusory. No, his body almost collapsed. Obviously, she wanted to kill the woman in front of her with a single strike. On the other side, the woman suddenly closed her eyes slowly. At the same time, the space around her suddenly trembled, as if some sort of power was approaching. Right at this moment, the woman's thumb and index finger gently clamped together, and a wisp of sword light suddenly appeared on the tip of her finger. In the distance, Arrow suddenly roared, "Slash!" The wisp of sword light suddenly trembled and was about to break free from the woman's hand, but the woman's two fingers suddenly twisted. Boom! The sword light instantly collapsed and Arrow retreated thousands of feet. At the same time, her body directly became transparent. In the distance, the woman looked at Arrow, smiled and said, "From now on, Miss Arrow cannot leave this city. Otherwise, there will be no more Arrow in this world, no more great wilderness country." With that she turned and left. In the sky, Arrow suddenly turned her head and at this moment her eyes were filled with worry. The woman who just left had reached the realm of Returning Origin Realm Breaker. Returning Origin Realm Breaker before the age of 20. What kind of demonic deity was this? After the linen robe woman left the great wilderness country, she arrived in the sky. At this time a woman came to her side. This person was the one who came into contact with Zhou Xian Bai Yin. Bai Yin slightly bowed to the woman. "It's confirmed. His bloodline is exactly the same as that swordsman's." The linen robe woman smiled. "How is he?" Bai Yin spoke in a low voice. "He isn't simple." The linen robe woman spoke softly. "Of course he isn't simple." Bai Yin hesitated for a moment and said, "If young miss were to make a move, then killing him would probably be as easy as flipping your hand." The linen robe woman glanced at Bai Yin. "Do you know why my spirit race lost so miserably all those years ago?" Bai Yin lowered his head slightly and remained silent. The linen robe woman spoke softly. "Our seniors lost miserably all those years ago because they became arrogant. Since they left their homeland and arrived in this universe, they've been successful in every endeavor, and their strength has grown stronger and stronger. That's exactly why they've become arrogant. If they'd investigated that green-clothed man carefully all those years ago, then my spirit race wouldn't have lost so miserably." When she spoke up to hear, she gazed at Bai Yin. "We must take all our opponents seriously. Underestimating our opponents will cause us to be doomed eternally." Bai Yin hesitated for a moment and said, "Our seniors never imagined that the green-clothed swordsman would be so formidable." The linen robe woman smiled. "So we can't act rashly before that woman in a plain dress leaves. We can't afford to make the same mistake again." Bai Yin spoke in a low voice. "Young miss, is that woman really that strong?" The linen robe woman closed her eyes slowly. "If she doesn't leave, then my spirit race won't be able to leave the Yin spirit dimension for eternity." Bai Yin was astounded when he heard this. After a short while, the linen robe woman spoke softly. "Send my orders. No one is allowed to leave the Yin spirit dimension without my orders, and no one is allowed to act against Zhou Xian." I'll definitely kill anyone who dares to look for trouble with him before that woman leaves the sixth dimension. Bai Yin bowed slightly and left silently. The linen robe woman raised her head and looked towards the depths of the starry sky. With her vision she was still able to see that plain dress. A long time passed before she suddenly asked, "You should have killed me. Otherwise, I would have killed you if I had some time." Somewhere in the depths of the starry sky, the woman in a plain dress suddenly stopped moving. She glanced down while her eyes were filled with disdain. "I'll give you 100,000 years." As soon as she finished speaking, she vanished into the depths of the starry sky. Xian and Qing were flying swiftly through the starry sky. All along the way, Xian had a solemn expression on his face. Because he kept having the feeling that the matter wasn't so simple. Around 2 hours later, Xian suddenly sensed formidable sword in sight. He raised his head and looked over. There was a mountain standing towering not too far away, and flying swords frequently flew up from the mountain and shot into the depths of the starry sky. Xian gazed at Qing and the latter spoke softly, "This is the sword dimension. The sword dimension." As they spoke, Xian and Qing arrived at the peak of the mountain, and then they appeared before a hall. Before the hall, Xian saw the green-clothed man's statue once more. Meanwhile, Xiaoling appeared by Xian's side, and she gazed at the white little fellow on the green-clothed man's shoulder. Qing looked at Xian. "Let's go in." Xian nodded and the two of them were about to enter. At this moment Xiaoling suddenly ran to the green-clothed man's statue, and with a gentle stomp of her foot, the limestone floor cracked. Then she pushed away the gravel and took out a small white box. Xian and Qing were stunned. Xiaoling walked to Xian with the box in her arms and said with a grin, "Brother, look, it's a box." Xian looked at Qing and Qing replied in a deep voice, "I don't know." Xian looked at Xiaoling. "How did you know that there's a box below?" Xiaoling pointed at the white little fellow in the distance. "She told me secretly in the past." Xian was speechless. Qing smiled bitterly. "So it's her." Xian looked at Qing and Qing chuckled. "That little fellow likes to play with these things. In any case, she's very mischievous." Fortunately, Sect Master and Madam Sect Master are here. Otherwise, that little fellow will destroy the entire sword sect. She's really too mischievous. Xian smiled. "Mischievous?" Qing nodded. "She likes to exchange candied haws with others. Let's not talk about her. Talking about her gives me a headache." Xian was speechless. A moment later, Qing led Xian towards the hall. Xiaoling happily carried the box back into the prison pagoda. "Box." Xiaoling hugged the box and started mumbling. Xian followed Qing into the hall and the hall was empty. Not only in the hall but the entire sword sect was empty. Qing said solemnly, "They should be at the entrance of the Yin spirit world. Young sect master, please wait here for a moment. I'll be back soon." After saying that, he turned into a sword ray and disappeared into the distance. Only Xian was left in the hall. Xian got up and walked to the entrance of the hall. He looked into the distance and shook his head. There was not a single person in the sword sect. Weren't they afraid that someone would come to steal their nest? At this moment, a sword ray suddenly landed in front of the hall. When the sword ray dissipated, a female swordsman walked out. When the female swordsman saw Xian, she was slightly stunned. "Who are you?" Xian said. "Xian." "Xian?" The female swordsman frowned. "I've never heard of you." "Never heard of you." Xian blinked and said, "I'm your young sect master." The woman sized up Xian. "Our sword sect only has a sect master. There has never been a young sect master. Did you give yourself that title?" Xian's face darkened. "Nothingness dimension." Old tomb keeper who was sweeping the tomb suddenly looked up. Not far away from him, a woman in linen robes was walking towards him. Old tomb keeper frowned when he saw the woman in linen robes. The woman in linen robes walked to a tomb and glanced at it. She smiled. "I heard that Yi Ling is in this tomb. I want to invite her to the Yin spirit world as a guest." After saying that, she turned to look at old tomb keeper. "Do you want to help? You can give it a try." Old tomb keeper shook his head. "I won't help. Do as you wish." The woman in linen robes nodded. She looked at the tomb and tapped it with her finger. A white light shot towards the tomb. Just as the white light was about to blast onto the tomb, a voice suddenly resounded from within the tomb. Who dares to disturb my sister Xiao? As soon as the voice resounded, a small fist suddenly blasted onto the white light. Boom! The beam of white light shattered into pieces. Chapter 1156. At the instant the white light shattered, a little girl appeared before the tomb. The little girl had a horn on her head and a tail on her back. The old man's eyelids twitched when he saw the little girl. It's this fellow again. It was this fellow who'd forcefully resisted his spear all those years ago, and then his spear and hand had broken. As soon as the little girl appeared, she gazed at the woman in linen robes. How dare you disturb my big sister Xiao? Believe it or not, I'll smash your head apart. The woman in linen robes gazed at the little girl and smiled. You can try. The little girl suddenly vanished on the spot and smashed her fist towards the woman in linen robes. The woman's eyes narrowed slightly as she smashed her fist forward. A head-on collision. The old man's eyelids twitched when he witnessed this scene. This woman is going head-on against the little girl? Bang! An explosion suddenly resounded, and then the woman instantly retreated explosively. However, she pressed her right hand down lightly when she retreated over 30 m and then she stopped. However, the space behind her had instantly collapsed. It was pitch black. The old man's face instantly fell when he witnessed this scene. She'd actually resisted it. The woman glanced at her slightly cracked fist, and then she gazed at the little girl and smiled. You're so strong. The little girl glanced at her fist and frowned slightly. Why didn't I just punch you to death? The linen-robed woman smiled and said, because you're just a clone. A clone. The little girl glanced at her own body, and then she gazed at the old man. I'm just a clone? The corners of the old man's mouth twitched. Oh my God. Don't you know that you're just a clone? Oh my God. The old man almost fainted. Meanwhile, the little girl seemed to have figured out the situation she was in, and she gazed at the woman. Take another punch from me. The woman shook her head. No, no. The little girl frowned slightly. Why? The woman smiled. I can't do anything to you with the strength of your body. Of course, you can't do anything to me without your main body. So, it's meaningless for us to continue fighting. As soon as she finished speaking, she turned around and left. She would never do meaningless things. At this moment, the little girl suddenly appeared in front of her. She looked at the linen-robed woman and pointed at the grave in the distance. Sister Xiao is sleeping. Don't disturb her or I'll kill you. The linen-robed woman smiled and said, all right. The little girl blinked. I'm threatening you. Aren't you angry? If I were you, I would beat anyone who dares to threaten me to death. Oh, except for a certain woman with a sword. The linen-robed woman blinked her eyes. A woman with a sword? The little girl said indifferently, actually, I'm not very afraid of her. As she spoke, she glanced at the old man in the distance. It's true. The tombkeeper was speechless. Why did you tell me if you weren't afraid? The hemp-robed woman asked. Is it that girl in the plain dress? The little girl looked at the linen-robed woman. You know her. The linen-robed woman nodded. Have you fought her before? The little girl nodded. I did. The linen-robed woman asked curiously, did he lose? The little girl thought for a moment and said, actually, it can't be considered a loss. Right, it's 50-50. The linen-robed woman frowned slightly. You have a 50-50 chance of winning against her? The little girl looked at the linen-robed woman and was slightly angry. You don't believe me? The linen-robed woman thought for a moment and asked, your main body has a 50-50 chance of winning against her? The little girl had an emotionless expression. Yes. The linen-robed woman grinned. I understand. She naturally believed the little girl. How could a peerless expert like the little girl possibly lie? The little girl was slightly puzzled. What do you understand? The linen-robed woman smiled. I have a rough idea of her true strength. The little girl blinked. You know. The linen-robed woman nodded. I have a rough idea. As soon as she finished speaking, she turned around and left. The little girl suddenly asked, do you want to beat her up? The linen-robed woman smiled. Can't I? As soon as she finished speaking, she vanished into the distance. The little girl turned around to look at the tombkeeper. The tombkeeper's eyelids twitched. What do you intend to do? The little girl blinked. She said that she wanted to beat that woman up. The tomb keeper hesitated for a moment and said, "Is that woman very strong?" The little girl spoke indifferently. "She's just as if. In any case, I fought her to a draw." As soon as she finished speaking, she transformed into a ray of black light that entered the tomb. A draw? The tomb keeper had a slightly strange expression on his face. His intuition told him that something wasn't right, because the little girl before him was just like Zhou Xian. Both of them were quite flashy. The tomb keeper turned around and looked towards the horizon. Did that woman really think that the little fellow had fought that woman to a draw? The sword sect. Zhou Xian sat within Sword Hall while the swordsman woman sat opposite him. At this moment old Gu was present as well. The swordsman woman ceaselessly sized up Zhou Xian with a curious gaze. Zhou Xian was quite speechless. "Why are you looking at me?" The swordsman woman smiled. "You really are our young sect master." Old Gu spoke abruptly. "Aoji, do you still doubt me?" The woman named Aoji smiled. "No, Old Gu, why would you spout nonsense? I'm just curious." Old Gu shook his head. Aoji suddenly spoke. "Shall we spar?" Zhou Xian looked at Aoji. "Spar with me?" Aoji nodded. "Let's spar. Don't worry, I won't hurt you." Zhou Xian's expression became a little strange. To be honest, he was most afraid of swordsmen. Even if Arrow fought him, he wouldn't be afraid, let alone the woman before him. With his current strength, he could even devour Arrow's sword. Of course, he was still a little afraid of Arrow's slit-throat move. Aoji suddenly stood up and smiled. "Come, young sect master. Let's have a good spar." Old Gu was about to speak when Zhou Xian suddenly smiled. "All right. Let's spar." Old Gu looked at Zhou Xian. Zhou Xian smiled. "It's fine. It's just a simple spar. It doesn't matter." Old Gu nodded. "Don't overdo it." Zhou Xian nodded. Both of them left the sword hall and came out of the main hall. Aoji looked at Zhou Xian and smiled. "You have to be careful." After that, she opened her palm and a green sword appeared in her hand. The next moment, a green sword ray suddenly slashed at Zhou Xian. Zhou Xian moved sideways and dodged the sword ray. At the same time, Aoji suddenly appeared in front of him and stabbed her sword at his chest. The sword was as fast as lightning. With a light tap of his right foot, Zhou Xian retreated 100 feet. This retreat was just enough for him to dodge the sword. Aoji did not draw her sword. She looked at Zhou Xian. At this moment, her expression became serious. Zhou Xian was able to dodge her sword every time. What did this mean? It meant that Zhou Xian's attainments in kendo were above hers. Aoji thought for a moment and said, "Aren't you going to draw your sword?" Zhou Xian nodded. "Okay." After saying that, he suddenly disappeared. The speed of this strike caused Aoji's expression to change drastically. She did not choose to retreat and instead thrust her sword forward. Because she could not retreat from this strike. Hong. As the sword ray shattered, Aoji instantly retreated 300 meters away. Zhou Xian did not attack again. Instead, he looked at the sword in his hand. It was an ordinary sword. If he used the Tendo sword or the Executing Heaven sword, the Executing Heaven sword should be able to kill Akiji with this sword. Ever since he started cultivating with the Tendo sword, he realized that he had improved greatly in all aspects. Although he was only in the rebirth tier, he was completely capable of killing Shattering Void tier elites, especially his current physical body. It was no exaggeration to say that in the entire fifth dimension, Zhou Xian's physical body was number 1. Aoji did not attack again because she knew that Zhou Xian had already shown mercy. Zhou Xian put away his sword and looked at Old Gu. "Old Gu, can I go to the Netherworld spirit world to have a look?" Old Gu hesitated and then said, "Why not wait? Senior Sister Lu and the others will be back soon." Zhou Xian nodded. "All right." At this moment, in the distant horizon, a sword cry suddenly resounded. Soon a sword ray landed not far from Zhou Xian and the others. The person who came was Lu Yunxian. Seeing Zhou Xian, Lu Yunxian was slightly startled. Then she smiled and said, "Little junior brother, you're here?" Zhou Xian nodded. "Senior brother Lu." Lu Yunxian nodded slightly. "It's good that you're here. It saves me the trouble of going to fetch you." Zhou Xian frowned slightly. "Fetch me? What do you mean?" Lu Yunxian said in a low voice. "It's a bit serious." Zhou Xian was slightly puzzled. "What do you mean?" Lu Yunxian looked at Zhou Xian. "Senior Sister Lu is injured." Senior Sister Lu? Yi Xian was about to speak when he suddenly noticed that Old Gu and Qing Ji's expressions had become solemn. Yi Xian gazed at Old Gu. Old Gu spoke in a low voice. Senior Sister Lu is the best fighter in our sword sect right now. The best fighter. Yi Xian came to an understanding when he heard that. The best fighter is injured. Yi Xian's expression gradually became solemn as well. Lu Yunxian spoke in a low voice. They might be targeting little junior brother. So, Senior Sister Lu was just about to send me to fetch little junior brother. I never expected that you would come yourself. Did you encounter any mishaps along the way? Yi Xian spoke in a low voice. I encountered the spirit race. Lu Yunxian frowned. So their target really is you? Old Gu suddenly asked. Can you contact the sect master? Lu Yunxian laughed bitterly. No. Senior Sister Lu has already tried. The sect master should be extremely far away from here. Yi Xian was about to speak when Lu Yunxian suddenly raised his head and looked towards the horizon. In the next moment his expression changed. That woman has appeared again. Let's go. As soon as he finished speaking, he transformed into a ray of light and vanished into the horizon. Yi Xian and the others hurriedly followed after him. A woman in a green dress stood with a sword in her hand, and a woman in linen robes stood 300 m away from her. The woman in linen robes had her hands behind her back as she looked up at the starry sky. No one knew what she was looking at. The woman with the sword looked at the woman in linen robes and was about to attack. Meanwhile, the woman in linen robes suddenly smiled. Miss Lu, wait a moment. If you want to fight, then my spirit race will fight your sword sect to our heart's content. The woman with the sword frowned slightly. What are you waiting for? The woman in linen robes chuckled lightly. I'm waiting for a woman to leave. The woman with the sword looked up into the starry sky. In a certain part of the starry sky, a woman in a plain dress appeared in the air, and wherever she went the space would tear inch by inch. Soon she arrived at a dead and silent part of the starry sky. Looking at the dead and silent part of the starry sky, she was about to attack when a middle-aged man suddenly appeared not far away from her. The person who came was Yu Bai, who had gone to the lower realm from the 6th dimension to find Tendo. Yu Bai looked at the woman in the plain dress and smiled faintly. We want to invite Miss to the Union Hall for some tea. Miss won't refuse, right? As he spoke, several dozen powerful auras suddenly appeared around the woman in the plain dress. All of them were at the peak stage of the Shattering Void tier. Several dozen elites at the peak stage of the Shattering Void tier. This lineup could only be described as terrifying. At this time Yu Bai smiled again and said, Don't worry, Mississippi. As long as that Yi Xian hands over the study, we won't harm Mississippi. Chapter 1157. In the starry sky, the plainly dressed woman looked at Yu Bai with a calm expression. Yu Bai looked at the plainly dressed woman, and though he had a smile on his face, he was extremely wary in his heart. They didn't dare to underestimate this woman who could make it all the way here. After all, an ordinary person couldn't make it all the way here. At this moment, the plainly dressed woman suddenly pointed at herself. Use me to threaten him? Yu Bai smiled, sort of. As he spoke, he glanced at the elites around him and continued, If you're smart, don't make a stupid choice because that's really unwise. The plainly dressed woman looked at Yu Bai. At this moment she was speechless. At this moment, Yu Bai suddenly made an inviting gesture. Sir, our Union Hall has already prepared tea, please. The plainly dressed woman shook her head and said softly, Looks like I was too kind. Yu Bai's eyes narrowed and his right hand slowly clenched. Are you going to make a stupid choice? The plainly dressed woman opened her palm and a sword suddenly flew out. In an instant dozens of heads soared into the sky along with dozens of pillars of blood, extremely bloody. At this moment, aside from Yu Bai, all the super elites around him died. And these fallen elites, after their heads flew out, their eyes were filled with confusion. They didn't understand the situation even in death. How did they die? This was the only thought left in these elites' minds. Instant kill with a single strike. And Yu Bai was stunned on the spot. At this moment he suspected that he was dreaming. Those Shattering Void tier elites were instantly killed just like that. It was too unreal. At this moment the plainly dressed woman suddenly said, Where did you come from? Hearing this, Yu Bai came back to his senses. He looked at the plainly dressed woman as if he was looking at a demon. What are you going to do? At this moment he was truly terrified. Instant kill dozens of Shattering Void Tier elites with a single strike? Even Return to Origin Shattering Void Tier elites couldn't do it. Had this woman reached self-release? Yubai was completely dumbfounded. Just at this moment, the woman in the plain dress slowly closed her eyes. In the next moment she suddenly turned her head and looked over. She could see a distance of 1,000,000 kilometers with a single glance. In the horizon that was 1,000,000 kilometers away stood a tall palace. The palace stretched across the horizon and it was ancient and mysterious. The Union Hall. It could be said that this was one of the most powerful places in the sixth dimension, as well as the most mysterious place in the sixth dimension. This place was separated into the Literature Hall and the Martial Hall. The Wen Palace Hall was filled with scholars, but the Martial Arts Hall, it wasn't an exaggeration to say that the Martial Arts Hall's experts were the pinnacle of the sixth dimension. The sixth dimension had 7 absolute martial experts, and the Martial Arts Hall had 2 of them. A man stood in the sky above the Union Hall. He wore silver armor and held a silver spear. This person was one of the 6 experts of the sixth dimension, Xuezi. He was also the guardian of the Union Hall. His duty was to guard the Union Hall and deter thieves and rascals. Under his watch, nothing had ever happened to the Union Hall in the past 10,000 years. At that moment Xuezi suddenly opened his eyes. He raised his head and roared furiously, "Impudent! Who dares to spy on me, you?" As he spoke, a wisp of sword light suddenly slashed through his throat. The head of one of the 6 great experts of the sixth dimension, Xuezi, flew out and blood spurted out like a fountain. Xuezi's eyes were filled with disbelief when his head was sent flying. That sword was so fast that he didn't even have the strength to fight back. It was the fastest and strongest sword he had ever seen in his life. It was also the only time he didn't fight back. It wasn't that he didn't want to fight back, but he couldn't. That sword had directly severed everything he had. Even his soul couldn't escape. That sword had erased him. It had forcefully erased him. That sword didn't disappear. After Xuezi was killed, it directly slashed into the Union Hall. However, when the sword was about to slash into the Union Hall, the entire Union Hall suddenly shook violently. Then a black light soared into the sky. The Union Hall's protective array. The array of the Union Hall hadn't appeared for tens of thousands of years. However, as soon as the array touched the sword light, it instantly turned into nothingness. Then the sword light entered the Union Hall. Boom! The entire Union Hall turned into nothingness. Inside, countless experts of the Union Hall died. At that moment the entire sixth dimension was shocked. Countless experts looked at the Union Hall. Someone attacked the Union Hall? Who was it? As of now, there wasn't a single force in the entire sixth dimension that could destroy the Union Hall alone. But at that moment, someone had actually attacked the Union Hall. Around the destroyed Union Hall, countless experts of the Union Hall were dumbfounded. These people were the ones who had escaped. The moment the Union Hall's guardian Xuezi died, a group of people had escaped. The moment the Union Hall's great array appeared, another group of people had escaped. However, not many had escaped. It could be said that at least 70% of the people in the Union Hall had died under that sword. It was a huge loss. At that moment these people still didn't know who had attacked with that sword. Most importantly, the spiritual energy in the field was dissipating at an extremely fast speed. Within the Union Hall there was a spiritual vein. This spiritual vein was the best spiritual vein in the sixth dimension. It was also because of this spiritual vein that the spiritual energy in the entire sixth dimension was balanced. This was because this spiritual vein was the core of countless protective arrays. Once this spiritual vein was destroyed, the countless protective arrays built by the Union Hall would all lose their effectiveness. Not only in the field, but the spiritual energy in countless places in the entire sixth dimension was also starting to dissipate. This problem was very serious. In the field, the expressions of the scholars of the Wen Palace were extremely ugly. In the distant starry sky, the woman in the plain dress withdrew her gaze and looked at Yubai. The latter stared at her. "You are a self-release realm expert." The woman in the plain dress glanced at Yubai. "Self-release realm? What kind of trash is that?" After saying that, she had already appeared tens of thousands of li away. Yu Bai's body gradually became illusory. Yu Bai looked at the depths of the starry sky, his mind blank. Self-release. This was not the highest known realm of the fifth dimension but the sixth dimension. Escape from the Grand Tao, not within the Grand Tao. This was self-release. Since ancient times this realm had always been a legend. Just now when he saw the woman in the plain dress kill Yu Bai, he knew that she was at least at the self-release realm. Because Yu Bai was at the half-step self-release realm, and he had reached that level 10,000 years ago. However, a single sentence from the woman in a simple dress caused him to go mad. Self-release? What kind of trash was that? She was above self-release. Fifth dimension Tendo, you big scammer. This was Yu Bai's last thought. At the end of the distant starry sky, the woman in the plain dress tore through space. Her expression was calm and there were no ripples in her eyes. Just as she was about to leave the sixth dimension, an old man suddenly appeared in front of the woman in the plain dress. The old man looked at the woman in the plain dress and said, "Old man is the protector of this universe. Did you know that the sword just now destroyed the foundation of the sixth dimension? The spiritual chi in countless places will disappear, the entire sixth dimension." The woman in the plain dress suddenly said, "Do you have an opinion?" Saying that, she turned and slashed out. The sword slashed out tens of thousands of li wherever the sword passed, space shattered, mountains and rivers collapsed and spiritual veins were destroyed. One sword heavily injured the sixth dimension. This moment was simply doomsday for the sixth dimension. If the first sword could be said to have shaken the foundation of this universe, then the second sword could directly destroy this universe. This sword directly heavily injured the entire sixth dimension. At this moment, at least half of the sixth dimension's origin was destroyed by this sword. It could be said that the spiritual chi world that the Union Hall had maintained for tens of thousands of years collapsed under this sword. The old man in front of the woman in the plain dress was dumbfounded. The power of this sword was beyond his imagination. The consequences of this sword were even more unimaginable. The old man looked at the woman in the plain dress and said with a trembling voice, "Who the hell are you?" The woman in the plain dress ignored the old man. She had already appeared thousands of li away. Behind her, the old man's body gradually became illusory. The old man was petrified and his eyes were filled with disbelief. He knew that he was already dead. However, he did not see how the woman in the plain dress had attacked. He had been instantly killed. What kind of monster was this? At the end of the starry sky, the woman in the plain dress stopped again. Not far in front of her stood a white figure. The sixth dimension's Tendo. The woman in the plain dress's sword had directly injured the origin of this universe. Besides the people of this universe, the Tendo of this universe was also injured. The Tendo looked at the woman in the plain dress and said, "Why did you do this?" The woman in the plain dress walked in front of the Tendo. The Tendo stared at the woman in the plain dress and said, "That sword of yours will cause countless living beings to die tragically. You are so powerful, why don't you have any mercy?" Mercy and compassion? The woman in the plain dress stopped. She looked at the Tendo and said, "I used up that toy a long time ago." The Tendo looked at the woman in the plain dress and said, "That sword of yours heavily injured the universe. It is an evil cause. Aren't you afraid of evil karma?" The woman in the plain dress looked at the Tendo and a trace of disdain appeared at the corner of her mouth. "Karma? That is used to bind mortals." The Tendo's pupils suddenly shrank. "You are really not part of the Grand Tao." At the beginning it was just a guess. However, at this moment she was sure. The woman in front of her was definitely at the self-release realm. She was no longer part of the Grand Tao, so how could karma affect her body? Thinking of this, the Tendo's heart was incomparably bitter. Why did the woman in front of him attack? Because the experts of the sixth dimension went to kill her. This was the cause, and her attack was the karma for those experts in this universe. This was the evil karma of the sixth dimension's experts and the sixth dimension's universe. At this moment, the woman in the plain dress suddenly opened her palm and a sword appeared in her hand. She looked at the Tendo and said, "I don't like your world anymore." Hearing this, the Tendo's expression changed. She immediately bowed respectfully and said, "I ask your honor to be lenient. Please be lenient to this universe." She knew that the life and death of the sixth dimension's universe was in the hands of this woman in the plain dress. The woman in front of her had the ability to destroy the sixth dimension. This time the Union Hall had kicked an iron plate. Not only did they destroy themselves, but they also implicated the entire sixth dimension. Thinking of this, the Tendo bowed again and said, "I ask your honor to be lenient." The woman in the plain dress looked at the Tendo and said after a moment, "I will think about it." The Tendo, one good thought, thousands of rivers and thousands of mountains. One evil thought, the blue sea turned into mulberry fields. P.S. Erupt in advance. Because tomorrow I have to go out and line up to buy a mask. I have to go very early, otherwise there won't be any left. Therefore erupt in advance today. If you think I'm good looking, then vote for me. Chapter 1158. Think about it. All of a sudden the surroundings fell silent. The sixth dimension Tendo did not speak. Resist? She knew that all resistance was futile. There might be a chance of survival if she begged for mercy. After a while, the plain-dressed woman suddenly looked down and pointed somewhere. "Do you see that swordsman?" The Tendo looked down and said softly, "That young swordsman?" The plain-dressed woman nodded. "Yes." The Tendo looked at the plain-dressed woman. "What about him?" The plain-dressed woman looked at the Tendo. "He is my brother." The Tendo, the plain-dressed woman walked into the distance. When she passed by the Tendo, she suddenly said, "He will come here soon. Do you understand what I mean?" The Tendo nodded. "I understand. I will arrange it well." The plain-dressed woman nodded. The next moment she was already at the end of the starry sky. Feeling this scene, the Tendo let out a long sigh of relief. No one saw that cold sweat was dripping down her forehead. Because in that instant she had felt a killing intent. She knew that the woman in front of her really wanted to destroy this universe. That woman had the ability to destroy the universe. And the reason why the other party gave up should be related to that young swordsman. Thinking of this, the Tendo bent down to look. There was a trace of doubt in her eyes. Her brother? About a quarter of an hour later, the plain-dressed woman arrived in front of a barrier. It was the cosmos barrier. In the entire history of the sixth dimension, no one had ever passed through this universe. The plain-dressed woman walked in front of the cosmos barrier. With a wave of her right hand, a wisp of sword light slashed out. The indestructible cosmos barrier was instantly torn apart. At this moment, an ancient voice suddenly came from the crack. "Ignorant mortal, you dare to peep into the Tao world. Do you want your god's soul to be destroyed?" At this moment, the plain-dressed woman walked in. In the blink of an eye, a bloody head rolled out from the spatial crack. The crack in space closed up and the head rolled and rolled. After the plain-dressed woman entered the crack, somewhere in the starry sky, the sixth dimension Tendo turned to look. Gradually, her expression became unprecedentedly serious. That woman actually left. They left. At this moment, Tendo's hands were trembling. "Release one. I'm afraid it's not just that." In the five-dimensional universe, outside the Yin spirit world, the linen-robed woman suddenly withdrew her gaze. She looked at the swordsman woman in the distance and said with a smile, "She's gone." Gone. There was a hint of relief in his voice. When that woman was around, she gave the Yin spirit world too much pressure. As she had said, if that woman did not leave, the Yin spirit world would never come out. But now that woman had left. The linen-robed woman looked at the swordsman woman and said with a smile, "Miss Lu, didn't you want to fight? We spirits of the Dark Ones will fight you to our heart's content." Then she gently waved her hand. Boom. Hundreds of teleportation formations suddenly appeared behind her. In the next moment, countless spirits of Dark Yin rushed out from those teleportation formations. Seeing this, the swordsman woman's expression gradually sank. If it was a one-on-one battle, the spirits of Nine Dead would never be able to defeat the Sword Sect. But now the spirits of Nine Dead obviously would not fight the Sword Sect one-on-one. Endless Yin spirits continuously rushed out from those teleportation formations. Among them there were actually hundreds of ruler-tier elites. Apart from them, there were also more than 60 elites at the peak stage of the Shattering Void tier. Seeing this lineup, the expressions of the swordsman woman and the swordsman behind her changed. Obviously they had underestimated the Yin spirit world. The linen-robed woman looked at the swordsman woman and said with a smile, "Miss Lu, we did not come out before not because we were afraid of your sword sect, but because of that plain-dressed woman. With all due respect, with the absence of your sword sect master, your sword sect cannot stop us." The swordsman woman glanced at the linen-robed woman. Retreat. As her voice fell, the swordsman behind her turned into a flash of sword light, disappearing into the horizon. The swordsman woman looked at the linen-robed woman, and the sword in her hand suddenly flew out. In the distance, the linen-robed woman grabbed forward with her right hand. This grab directly caught the swordsman woman's sword, and at this moment, a flash of sword light suddenly slashed in front of the linen-robed woman. The linen-robed woman raised the swordsman woman's sword to block. Hong! The flash of sword light exploded, and the linen-robed woman retreated several steps, while the swordsman woman returned to her original position. The swordsman woman spread out her hands and then suddenly clenched them. In an instant, tens of thousands of sword chi appeared behind her. Beside the linen-robed woman, the two old men were about to attack, but the linen-robed woman waved her right hand lightly, and the two old men retreated. The linen-robed woman took a step forward, and at this time, the swords behind the swordsman woman suddenly flew out. Chi 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 chi. In an instant the whole horizon was torn apart. The linen-robed woman pointed her finger forward lightly. Return to origin. As soon as her finger descended, a ripple suddenly appeared in the space before her, and in the next moment, the sword chi that covered the sky started to dissipate bit by bit. When he saw this scene, a trace of fear flashed in the eyes of the martial arts hall's hall master, Wu Xianxia. The strength of the spirit of Nine Yin had greatly exceeded his expectations. It could be said that colluding with the spirit of Nine Yin was like asking a tiger for its skin. However, the higher realm didn't have a choice now. Since they were tricked by Tendo, the higher realm could be said to have suffered heavy losses. If they didn't rely on the spirit of Nine Yin, then the higher realm wouldn't be able to resist Zhou Xian and the others. Of course, the spirit of Nine Yin being so strong was beneficial to the higher realm as well. As long as they could return to the sixth dimension, some sacrifices were worth it. In the distance, when the sword chi dissipated, the linen-robed woman suddenly took a step forward and blasted a fist forward. Under this fist, the space around the swordsman woman directly collapsed layer by layer. The swordsman woman didn't retreat but advanced instead. She took a step forward and pressed the sword between her brows while chanting silently. In an instant she held the sword with both hands and slashed forward. Destroy. A ray of sword light suddenly slashed down fiercely from the center of the battlefield. This sword seemed to want to tear the heavens and the earth apart, and it was extremely shocking. Wherever the ray of sword light passed, the space was directly torn apart, and the formidable strength of the linen-robed woman was also torn apart. The ray of sword light descended in a straight line and slashed towards the linen-robed woman. At the instant the ray of sword light descended, the linen-robed woman suddenly vanished. In the distance, the swordsman woman suddenly turned around and slashed down with her sword. The ray of sword light was like snow. Bang! The ray of sword light shattered, and the swordsman woman appeared where the linen-robed woman had been standing. At this moment, a fist tore through the air and blasted towards her face. The swordsman woman blocked it with her sword. Bang! The swordsman woman instantly retreated explosively by 300 m. After the swordsman woman stopped, she swung her sword horizontally. In the distance, the space around the linen-robed woman was suddenly sliced apart. In an instant, numerous rays of sword light flashed and slashed through the linen-robed woman's body. Hiss! Layers of space around the linen-robed woman split apart, and the linen-robed woman herself became illusory. After a moment of silence, the ray of sword light suddenly shattered, and the linen-robed woman walked out from within. The swordsman woman looking at the linen-robed woman, she said, "You're not just a returning essence realm breaker." The linen-robed woman smiled. Yes. The swordsman woman took a deep look at the linen-robed woman. Just as she was about to retreat, the linen-robed woman smiled. "You can't leave." The swordsman woman smiled. "You want to kill me?" The linen-robed woman retorted. "Can't I do it?" As soon as her voice fell, she stomped her right foot. Bang! In an instant, the space around the swordsman woman directly collapsed. In the next moment, a mysterious force continuously slashed towards the swordsman woman. At this moment, the swordsman woman was already in a state of illusory. At this time, the linen-robed woman's lily-white hand lightly swiped forward. With this swipe, the swordsman woman's body directly became illusory. In that strange space, The swordsman woman wielded her sword with both hands and slashed. The ray of sword light tore. However, she was still trapped in that strange space. The swordsman woman's eyes flashed with a trace of ruthlessness. She suddenly sheathed the sword in her hand, and in the next moment she suddenly drew her sword and slashed. Ultimate heaven-slaying sword-drawing technique. With one slash, that strange space directly shattered. At this time, a ray of sword light suddenly appeared in front of the swordsman woman. The swordsman woman's pupils suddenly shrank. She dodged to the side, but it was still a little too late. With this flash, although she had dodged, one of her arms had been sent flying. A few hundred feet away, the swordsman woman looked at where she was originally standing. The linen-robed woman was standing there, and in her hand there was a sword. Swordsman. The linen-robed woman was also a swordsman. Moreover, she had reached the peak of the third tier of the common sword realm. A swordsman who was at the origin returning realm breaker realm. If it was just the origin returning realm breaker realm, then it wouldn't be particularly terrifying. However, if she had the identity of a swordsman, and a swordsman who had reached the third level of the common sword realm, this wasn't just an ordinary level of terror. The linen-robed woman looked at the swordsman woman and smiled. Miss Liu, I originally wanted to use the identity of a swordsman to have a fair battle with you, but I suddenly remembered that I'm the spirit of Yin tribe's clan leader. I can't do things according to my personal preferences. Therefore, I concealed my identity as a swordsman in order to catch you off guard and kill you. Because as of now, the only troublesome person in the sword sect is you. With that said, she opened her palm and the sword in her hand suddenly flew out. This sword was very strange and it gave people the feeling that it didn't exist. Seeing this sword, the swordsman woman held the sword with her left hand. She took a step forward and then she stabbed with her sword. Sword tip against sword tip. Bang! A wave of sword light suddenly erupted in front of the swordsman woman. In the next moment, the swordsman woman started to retreat madly, and as she retreated, her sword started to crack bit by bit. When she retreated a few hundred meters, the sword in the swordsman woman's hand had been broken to the point only the hilt remained. Just as the linen-robed woman's sword was about to stab into the space between the swordsman woman's brows, a figure flashed by, and in the next moment, a man appeared in front of the swordsman woman. The person who'd arrived was Zhou Xian. Zhou Xian didn't dodge and he allowed the linen-robed woman's sword to enter his chest. Bang! In an instant, a powerful aura swept out from within Zhou Xian's body. Zhou Xian's body trembled, but he was completely fine. Invincible sword body. It was at this moment that the countless elites of the Spirit of Dark in the surroundings suddenly roared angrily like wild beasts. One of the Spirit of Dark in the peak stage of the Shattering Void tier pointed at Zhou Xian and roared hysterically, "It's him, his bloodline is exactly the same as that man's. It's him." Ah! In the field, countless Spirit of Dark roared madly. The way they looked at Zhou Xian was as if they were looking at the enemy who'd killed their father. Zhou Xian. Chapter 1159. Zhou Xian was quite stunned as well. What do these Yin spirits mean? Why do they hate me so much? What the hell? Zhou Xian was quite stunned. The woman waved her right hand lightly, and the Yin spirits that were about to charge forward instantly stopped. Even though they were still staring fixedly at Zhou Xian, none of them dared to attack. The woman gazed at Zhou Xian with a trace of surprise in her eyes. When we investigated you earlier, they said that you could devour swords. I didn't really believe it, but I never expected that you would actually be able to devour swords. How did you do that? Zhou Xian glanced at the Yin spirit experts in the surroundings and smiled. Do all of you really want to kill me? The woman nodded. Yes. Zhou Xian smiled. Don't tell me that your main objective for leaving the Yin spirit world this time is to kill me. The woman in linen robes smiled and said, You're almost right. Zhou Xian's expression froze and he gazed at the woman a short while later. Is there something wrong with all of you? That green-clothed man killed your ancestor, so go look for him. Why are you looking for me? Is it because you can't defeat the big one so you look for the small one? The woman nodded. That's right. Zhou Xian was speechless. He'd almost cursed. The woman smiled. I'd intended to look for you, but I never expected that you'd come yourself. Just as well. As soon as she finished speaking, she was about to attack. Meanwhile, the swordsman behind Zhou Xian suddenly used her finger like a sword, and she swiped it lightly in front of Zhou Xian and her. Hiss. A ray of light flashed and a spatial rift appeared. In the next moment she brought Yi Xian along and entered the spatial rift. The woman frowned slightly and she swiped it lightly with her fair hand. Bang! The spatial rift disappeared without a trace. However, Yi Xian and the swordsman had vanished. Seeing this, the linen-robed woman frowned slightly. Space Dao Law. At this time, Bai Yin appeared beside the linen-robed woman. Miss, are you going to the sword sect? The linen-robed woman smiled and said, the sword sect has sword formations. If we go, we will have to fight against those powerful sword formations, and we will suffer great losses. As she spoke, she turned her head and looked at the horizon. Cross the sword sect and go to the 5th dimension. Then they will come out on their own. With that, she disappeared on the spot. Behind her, there were countless powerful spirits of dark Yin. They were densely packed and endless. The Yin spirit world had appeared. In a certain part of the starry sky, a woman in a white dress walked slowly while holding a small burnt fish. This woman was the 5th dimension Tendo. At this moment, the heavenly Tao suddenly stopped in her tracks. She turned around and a moment later she frowned. After a long silence, Tendo nibbled on the fish in his hand and continued to walk forward. At this time, a voice suddenly came from the side. When they arrive, the entire 5th dimension will be gone. Tendo stopped in her tracks and turned around. Not far to her right there stood a woman. Xiao Dao. Tendo smiled and said, what do you think of this genius spirit of dark Yin? The little Taoist said calmly, you already said that she is a genius. Tendo shook her head. Actually, if she had endured a little longer, this universe would have belonged to the spirit of dark Yin sooner or later. However, she made a fatal mistake. Xiao Dao frowned slightly. You mean she was too impatient? Tendo smiled and said, yes. Xiao Dao shook his head. No one can stop them. Tendo pointed below. Do you know? There are many powerful beings in this universe. Xiao Dao frowned slightly. What do you mean? Tendo blinked. In the 4th dimension there is a nether palace, there is a life-forbidden zone. In the 5th dimension there is an old man guarding a woman. That's right. There are also the Tao laws of the prophet. When the plainly dressed woman is here, she is undoubtedly number 1 and can suppress everything. However, even if she is not here, it does not mean that the spirit of dark Yin is invincible. Xiaodaoist looked at the sky and said, are the big shots you mentioned that haven't shown up related to Yi Xian? Tendo smiled and said, yes. Xiao Dao looked at Tendo deeply. You are too scary. At this moment she suddenly realized that the woman in front of her was the scariest, even scarier than the spirit of dark Yin. Xiao Dao said again, are you using him? Tendo nodded, yes. Xiao Dao shook his head. Can you not be so straightforward? Tendo smiled and said, I feel that even if I am a bad person I should do it openly. Xiao Dao was speechless. Tendo said softly, actually I am not using him. I am just taking advantage of the situation. The genius clan leader of the spirits of dark Yin was indeed gifted and talented. Unfortunately she cannot let go of her hatred. Hatred will lead her and the spirit of dark Yin to destruction. Xiao Dao said in a deep voice, I always feel that the spirit of dark Yin is not that simple. Tendo smiled and said, of course it is not that simple. Xiao Dao looked at Tendo and said, what do you mean? Heaven's Way smiled mischievously. Our spirit of 9 Yin's clan leader is fearless. However, she's still considered to be cautious. Even if she has some trump cards, she didn't make a move while the woman in the plain dress is still around. Xiao Dao was silent. Tendo suddenly said, Xiao Dao, don't make a move next. Let him face it himself. This is the karma between their family and the spirit of dark Yin. Moreover, it is best that you and Arrow do not interfere now. Between the two of you, one has not fully grown and the other is injured. You do not have the ability to fight against the spirit of dark Yin. With that, she looked at Xiao Dao and said, it is time for him to grow. With that, she turned around and walked away. Xiao Dao was silent for a moment, then he turned around and left as well. At the sword sect, Yi Xian brought the swordsman woman back to the sword sect. As soon as he returned to the sword sect, the swordsman woman suddenly brought him into a hall. Only she and Yi Xian were in the hall. Yi Xian looked at the swordsman woman in front of him and said, Senior Sister Lu? The woman said indifferently, you can call me Aunt Lu. Aunt Lu. Yi Xian's expression was a little strange. The woman looked at Yi Xian and said, You have reached the second level of the mortal sword technique? Xian nodded. The woman nodded slightly and said, not bad. At this time Lu Yunxian walked in and looked at Xian and then at the woman. Senior Sister Lu, how are your injuries? The woman shook her head and said, it's no big deal. With that he looked at Lu Yunxian and said, have the spirits left the spirit world? Lu Yunxian nodded and said, yes. The woman frowned and said, they didn't come to the sword sect? Lu Yunxian shook her head and said, they didn't come to the fifth dimension. Hearing this, Xian's expression changed. They went to the fifth dimension. How could the dimension of nothingness stop the spirit race? With that thought, Xian turned around and left. At this time, the swordsman woman suddenly said, can you defeat the spirits? Xian stopped and looked at the woman. The woman stood up and looked at Lu Yunxian and said, gather all the swordsmen. Lu Yunxian nodded and then looked at Xian and said, don't be impulsive. With that he turned around and left the hall. Only Xian and the woman were left in the hall. The woman walked to the entrance of the hall and looked at the statue of the swordsman in the distance and said softly, we have underestimated the spirits. Xian walked to the woman's side and said in a deep voice, that woman just now? The swordsman woman shook her head and said, it's not just her. That woman is called Guan Yin and she is the most outstanding genius in the history of the spirits. At first I thought that she only had a high realm, but I didn't expect her to be a swordsman. Moreover, her sword Dao is so high. With that she turned around and looked at Xian and said, they have two goals. The first is to kill you and the second is to dominate the fifth dimension. Xian said in a deep voice, just because I am the successor of the sword sect's leader, they want to kill me? The woman looked at Xian and said, yes. Xian was speechless and looked at the statue of the green-robed man in the distance. He was tricked by this guy. At this time, nearly 100 sword lights suddenly landed in front of the hall. Xian looked and found that there were a total of 119 swordsmen. There were very few people, but their strength was extremely terrifying. Because among these people, the lowest was a common sword tier cultivator and the lowest was a ruler tier cultivator. There were also more than 30 shattering void tier cultivators. This lineup, one had to admit, was really nature-defying. One had to know that these people were all swordsmen. Their battle prowess was many times stronger than an ordinary ruler tier elite. However, this lineup had no advantage in front of the spirits of dark. The spirits of dark were inexhaustible. The swordsman woman walked out of the hall and looked at the swordsman in front of her. Let's not waste time. The spirits of dark have already left the dark spirit world, and they are now waiting for us to find them. Since that is the case, we will do as they wish. All swordsmen of the sword sect. At this point she suddenly looked at Xian and said, from now on, all swordsmen will listen to young sect master's orders. Young sect master. Xian was dumbfounded. What the hell? Listen to me. In the hall, the swordsmen also followed Xian's example. When they saw Xian, many of them showed kindness while some showed curiosity. Obviously they all knew about Xian's background. In front of Xian, the swordsman woman said, I am injured and unable to fight anymore. I will leave the sword sect to you. Xian hesitated for a moment and said, Senior Sister Lu, don't you still have senior brother Lu Yunxian and the others? The woman looked at Xian in the eye. What? You don't have confidence? Xian shook his head. No, I want to say, the woman suddenly said angrily. Say what? I asked you to take the lead, so take the lead. What's with all the nonsense? Xian was shocked. So fierce. The woman said again, any other questions? Xian hurriedly shook his head. No problems. The woman nodded. The rest is up to you. I want to recuperate. I hope that all of you are still alive before I come out. As soon as she finished speaking, she turned and walked into the hall. In the hall, over 100 peerless swordsmen looked at Xian. Xian was speechless. He really did not expect this. Just like that, he directly changed from young sect master to sect master. Most importantly, these swordsmen in front of him did not seem to be hostile towards him. Xian looked at the green robe man in the distance. He carefully looked at the green robe man. Gradually his eyelids twitched. Damn it, why do I look like this guy? P.S. I went to buy a mask today. Damn it, what a waste. I queued for almost an hour and could only buy 2 and I even used one myself. Chapter 1160. Was it an illusion? Yi Xian touched his face. It didn't make sense. At this moment Lu Yunxian suddenly said, "Little junior disciple brother, what do we do next?" Yi Xian looked at Lu Yunxian. "Senior disciple brother Lu, to be honest, I've only just arrived at the sword sect." Lu Yunxian shook her head. "Let's not talk about that. Just tell me what to do next." After a moment of silence, Yi Xian said, "Okay." After saying this, he glanced at the swordsman. "Kill the spirit tribe." After saying this, he turned into a sword projection and disappeared into the horizon. Below, over 100 sword projections soared into the sky and disappeared into the horizon in the blink of an eye. After Yi Xian and the others left, senior disciple sister Lu suddenly appeared at the entrance of the palace. She looked at the statue of the man in the green robe in the distance and said softly, "I hope you made the right choice." After saying this, she turned around and left. In the distant horizon, over 100 sword projections tore through the clouds, and over 100 powerful sword intents shook heaven and earth. To put it bluntly, almost all the powerful swordsmen in the fifth dimension were here. These over 100 swordsmen were enough to destroy heaven and earth. Along the way, Yi Xian's expression was gloomy, and no one knew what he was thinking. At this moment, Lu Yunxian appeared beside Yi Xian with a smile. "What are you thinking about?" Yi Xian said in a solemn voice. Back then, the sect leader of the sword sect stopped the void spirit tribe by himself. Lu Yunxian nodded. "That's right. In fact, that battle was all thanks to the sect leader. If the sect leader hadn't killed all the super powerful spirit tribe cultivators, even our sword sect wouldn't have been able to stop them. This race's devouring and assimilation abilities are too terrifying." Yi Xian looked into the distance and no one knew what he was thinking. Lu Yunxian suddenly said, "Are we going to go after them just like that?" Yi Xian said softly, "We have no choice. If we don't stop them, they will target this world." Lu Yunxian smiled. "You want to protect this world?" Yi Xian smiled. "I want to protect my friends. Fu Wenzong, the Worldwide Academy, the Tian clan and the Wu clan. These were all things that Yi Xian could not give up." Lu Yunxian laughed. "You're quite similar to him. Both of you care a lot about the people around you." Yi Xian looked at Lu Yunxian. "Him?" Lu Yunxian nodded. "Yes, sect leader." Yi Xian was about to speak when countless shrill cries suddenly resounded from below. Yi Xian looked over and soon he frowned. Those were human voices. Countless humans were being assimilated by the dark spirits. At this moment, all the swordsmen in the sky suddenly stopped, because a linen-robed woman was standing not too far away from them. This woman was the leader of the spirits of Dark Yin, Guanyin. Guanyin smiled. "You guys came pretty fast." Yi Xian walked towards Guanyin and smiled. "I heard that the reason why you didn't come out before was because the plain-robed woman didn't leave?" Guanyin nodded. "Yes. Why? Are you using her to threaten me?" Yi Xian smiled. No. I just want to tell you that your goal is to kill me, right? Come, I'm here now. If you spirits of Dark Yin have the ability, come at me." Guanyin's lips curled up. "How about this? You and I fight one-on-one?" Yi Xian smiled. "Sure." Lu Yunxian, who was standing beside Yi Xian, wanted to say something but hesitated. If Yi Xian lost, it would undoubtedly be a fatal blow to the morale of the sword sect. However, he didn't say it, because if he stopped Yi Xian now, it would be equivalent to assuming that Yi Xian couldn't defeat Guanyin. This would affect the morale of the spirits of Dark Yin. In the distance, Yi Xian walked towards Guanyin. He opened his palm and the executing heaven sword appeared in his hand. Bai Yin smiled. "Come." Yi Xian suddenly disappeared on the spot. A cold light flashed. Guanyin's jade-like hand swiped forward. This swipe caused the space in front of her to be torn apart. Yi Xian's sword pierced through the torn space. But right at this moment, the sword ray suddenly appeared in front of her. A trace of surprise flashed in Guanyin's eyes. His understanding of space is actually so thorough. As she spoke, she clamped her fingers together. This clamp directly caught the sword ray. But right at this moment, a mysterious force suddenly suppressed her surroundings. Sword domain. The moment the sword domain appeared, Guanyin narrowed her eyes. At this moment, a trace of seriousness appeared in her eyes. She suddenly slapped her left hand behind her. Bang! In an instant, the space she resided in was transformed into nothingness. Meanwhile, numerous rays of sword light slashed through her surroundings. Hiss, 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 hiss. 4 rays of sword light shot out like bolts of lightning and slashed the area Guan Yin resided in into pieces. As for Yi Xian, he'd already returned to his original position. Yi Xian raised his head to look at Guan Yin. Meanwhile, his rays of sword light suddenly vanished. In the next moment, a shadow flashed before him, and it was so fast that it couldn't be seen by the naked eye. But right at this moment, a mysterious force suddenly appeared around Yi Xian. Sword domain. At the instant the sword domain appeared, the shadow slowed down. Meanwhile, Yi Xian stabbed with his sword. Yi Xian didn't defend himself against Guan Yin's punch. He wanted to exchange his life for hers. But right at this moment, Guan Yin suddenly withdrew his fist and swept it horizontally. Bang! Yi Xian's sword was directly smashed to the side. At the same time, Guan Yin's right fist punched toward Yi Xian's face. At this moment, Yi Xian suddenly let go of the executing heaven sword. His right hand grabbed Guan Yin's left hand that hadn't been withdrawn yet, and then he slammed it forward. At this time, Guan Yin's fist just happened to land on Yi Xian's face. Boom! Along with the sound of an explosion, Guan Yin and Yi Xian retreated at the same time. Both of them retreated hundreds of feet in an instant. In the distance, after Guan Yin stopped, she gently touched her face. Her face was slightly deformed. As for Yi Xian, although he'd taken a punch from her, he wasn't hurt at all. However, his expression was solemn. This was because when he collided with Guan Yin, a mysterious force had absorbed most of his strength. Meanwhile, the swordsmen behind Yi Xian exchanged glances, and their eyes were filled with gratification. They'd been quite worried in the beginning, but now it would seem like this young sect master of theirs wasn't simple at all. Yi Xian suddenly smiled and said, "Miss Guan, aren't you a swordsman? You can use a sword." "Use a sword." Old Man Gu's expression became slightly strange. "Who doesn't know that you can devour swords? Use a sword. How dare you say that?" Guan Yin shook her head and smiled. "Young Master Yi, you must be joking. If you can devour swords, then wouldn't I be asking to be humiliated by using a sword?" As she spoke, she walked slowly towards Yi Xian. "I can kill you without a sword." As soon as she finished speaking, she'd appeared around 3 m in front of Yi Xian, and then she smashed her fist towards Yi Xian's face. This punch was very slow and it seemed illusory and ethereal. Yi Xian closed his eyes slowly. He didn't use his body to resist this punch. He was very capable of resisting it, but he didn't do something so meaningless. Moreover, this punch wasn't simple at all. The execution heaven sword in Yi Xian's hand suddenly transformed into the soul suppression sword, and then he stabbed it forward. As soon as he did, a mysterious force enveloped Guan Yin. The sword domain. He'd noticed that the sword domain was extremely effective against extraordinary experts. Could be suppressed. Guan Yin's brows knit together slightly when the sword domain appeared. She didn't retreat and her fist shot straight at Yi Xian's head instead. On the other hand, Yi Xian's sword stabbed towards Guan Yin as well. Unfortunately, his fist was swifter than his sword. Boom. Yi Xian retreated dozens of meters in an instant, but Guan Yin also retreated dozens of meters. The moment she stopped, an extremely powerful soul force enveloped her. Soul-setting sword. Guan Yin frowned slightly. She opened her palm and a white light suddenly appeared above her head. On top of the white light was a soul force and this white light directly blocked the soul force. At this moment, Yi Xian suddenly disappeared from his spot. Guan Yin looked in front of her and her left hand suddenly punched out. This punch directly landed on Yi Xian's chest. It was very smooth and Yi Xian directly retreated hundreds of meters. However, a small wound appeared on Guan Yin's throat. After Yi Xian stopped, he looked at his chest. At this moment, his chest had directly caved in. At a glance, it looked extremely terrifying, but in reality it wasn't a big deal. Not only that, but his body was also recovering at an extremely fast speed. The Heart of Life. This was the effect of the Heart of Life given to him by the Tendo. As long as Yi Xian wasn't seriously injured or killed in an instant, his physical body would be able to continuously recover. Moreover, because of the Tendo sword, the spiritual energy of the world was continuously surging towards him. Simply put, when he fought with Yi Xian, it was equivalent to having the help of the world. Lu Yunxian and the others were shocked when they saw that Yi Xian's physical body had almost instantly recovered. Such a strong physical body? The smile on Guan Yin's face gradually disappeared. She looked at Yi Xian. I knew that your physical body was very strong, but I didn't expect it to be this strong. She had to admit that Yi Xian's physical body had greatly exceeded her expectations. Not only was it strong, but it also had the ability to heal. Was he really a swordsman? He was a body cultivator. Most importantly, she was also a swordsman. Under normal circumstances, it could be said that she could use her sword to break Yi Xian's invincible physical body. But the problem was that this fellow before her could devour her sword. What should I do? Her strongest point had become her weakest point in front of Yi Xian. Could be said that she was at a disadvantage when fighting Yi Xian, a huge disadvantage. Because Yi Xian's strength was clearly inferior to the swordsman, but she couldn't do anything to Yi Xian. What a headache. Meanwhile, Yi Xian stretched his body, and then he gazed at Guan Yin and smiled. Come, let's continue. As soon as he finished speaking, his figure vanished on the spot. A ray of light flashed, and everywhere it passed, space exploded inch by inch. Guan Yin had an emotionless expression on her face. A ball of black energy had suddenly condensed at the center of her palm, but no one noticed it. Meanwhile, Yi Xian had appeared in front of her, and then she suddenly vanished. At this moment she was extremely swift. However, Yi Xian's sword domain appeared once more, and it suppressed her speed. However, she was still able to smash her fist against Yi Xian's chest. This punch blasted Yi Xian 300 m away. As soon as Yi Xian stopped moving, Lu Yunxian's expression instantly changed drastically. Shit. It's the Yin energy of death. As he spoke, he charged at Yi Xian, but it didn't take long for him to stop. Everyone here was stunned. Because the Yin energy of death on Yi Xian's chest was gradually being absorbed by Yi Xian. The undying body. After his undying body was strengthened by Tendo, he was invincible to all evil. Could be said that he was the bane of death energy and Yin energy. Because all the experts he devoured were peerless experts. Moreover, he cultivated Tendo's cultivation technique. So, death energy and Yin energy posed no threat to him at all. Guan Yin stared fixedly at Yi Xian, and then she shook her head a short while later. You're being quite shameless. Chapter 1161. At this moment, Guan Yin really hadn't expected that Yi Xian would actually be able to devour even her energy of death. What sort of monster is he? Is he a black hole? He absorbs everything. Guan Yin really felt helpless. Yi Xian was her natural counter. The experts of the sword sect hadn't expected that Yi Xian would actually be able to absorb the energy of death. How did he do that? Lu Yunxian and the others had slightly strange expressions on their faces. Right at this moment, countless spirit of Yin suddenly appeared behind Guan Yin, and a dense mass of Yin spirits surrounded Yi Xian's group. The swordsman glanced at the surroundings. Even though they were facing so many Yin spirits, there wasn't a trace of fear on their faces. Yi Xian gazed at Guan Yin and smiled. You're not going to fight one-on-one anymore? Guan Yin shook her head. I've changed my mind. I want to gang up on them. As she spoke, she glanced at the swordsman behind Yi Xian and smiled. I have to admit that they're very strong. However, without the assistance of the sword sect sword formation, they aren't a huge threat to us. Yi Xian smiled. Is that so? Guan Yin nodded. You can give it a try. Yi Xian gazed at Guan Yin and roared furiously. Ancestor summon. Ancestor summon. Guan Yin's eyes narrowed slightly when she heard this, and she couldn't help but slowly clench her right hand. On the other hand, the expressions of the spirit of Yin experts changed drastically. Ancestor summon. Who's the ancestor of the sword sect? It's that green-clothed man. Yi Xian intends to summon his ancestor? Lu Yunxian and the others behind Yi Xian were slightly stunned. Ancestor summon? They wanted to summon their ancestor as well, but they weren't able to contact that green-clothed man at all. Right at this moment, a sword howl suddenly resounded from within Yi Xian's body. In the next moment, a sword suddenly shot into the sky from within Yi Xian's body. His sword piercing the horizon. When they saw the sword in the sky, the countless experts of the spirit of Yin instantly roared hysterically. They roared as they retreated, and they were astounded to the extreme. The green-robed man's sword. Many of the dark spirits who had survived from that time recognized this sword. This was the green-robed man's sword. At this moment, Guan Yin's expression turned somewhat unsightly. The azure-robed man. He asked himself honestly, could the current him defeat that green-robed man? It was obvious that she was no match for him right now. Not to mention the green-robed man's true body. Even if it was just a clone, she would not be able to deal with him. A clone was more than enough to deal a heavy blow to the spirits of 9 Yin. Countless Spirit of Yin experts were still roaring madly with rage. Even though they were roaring furiously, they were retreating incessantly. They would never forget the fear that man and his sword had caused them. The swordsmen of the sword sect were also dumbfounded. Could this little junior brother really summon the ancestor? At this moment, even Lu Yunxian and Gu Gu were slightly doubtful. In midair, Yixian stretched out his hand and gestured. The sword appeared in his grasp and then he pointed it at Guan Yin. Didn't you want to gang up on me? Come at me. The founding ancestor of my sword sect will fight your entire race by himself. Guan Yin gazed at Yixian. According to my knowledge, he isn't in this dimension. Yixian smiled. Is that so? Guan Yin suddenly said, kill. Obviously, she wasn't terrified by Yixian. However, none of the Spirit of Yin experts behind her dared to move. Because they were truly afraid. After all, that man had almost annihilated the Spirit of Yin race all those years ago. Guan Yin turned around to gaze at the Spirit of Yin race and she spoke fiercely. Could it be that our race is going to live in fear for our entire lives? The expressions of the Spirit of Yin race experts were quite unsightly. Right at this moment, an old man from the Spirit of Yin race suddenly stepped forward. He glanced at Yixian and then he said softly, this old man would like to see that swordsman again. As soon as he finished speaking, he started walking towards Yixian. The countless Spirit of Yin race experts instantly stopped moving when they saw the old man walk over, and they didn't continue moving back. Moreover, some of the Spirit of Yin race experts even followed behind the old man. At this moment, the eyes of all the Spirit of Yin race experts carried a strand of resolution. Not only had the sword failed to deter them, conversely, it had even given them the courage to fight desperately. Yixian's eyelids twitched. Seems like I've gone too far. Right at this moment, the sword in his hand suddenly trembled violently. In the next moment, a sword howl shook the heavens and the earth, and then a blood-red image suddenly appeared above Yixian. The swordsmen in the surroundings were instantly stunned when they saw this blood-red image. In the next moment, countless people were overjoyed. The sword spirit. It was the sword spirit of the sword sect's founding ancestor. On the other hand, the Spirit of Yin race experts were stunned on the spot. Terror appeared in the eyes of many Spirit of Yin race experts once more. Even the old man who led the group was stunned on the spot, and his eyes were filled with terror. On the other hand, Yixian was slightly stunned as well. This sword has a sword spirit, and it's alive. Yixian gazed at the blood-red sword spirit with a slightly strange expression on his face, because he noticed that the aura emanated by the sword was very similar to the aura of his bloodline. The sword spirit suddenly vanished. Guan Yin suddenly took a step forward and smashed his fist forward. Bang! Guan Yin was instantly pushed over 1 kilometer back, and the sky had been transformed into an ocean of blood. Countless Spirit of Yin race experts in the surroundings retreated repeatedly. Even the experts of the sword sect had retreated successively because the violent energy within the ocean of blood was too formidable. It affected one's mind. On the other hand, Yixian wasn't in a bad state because he was the least affected. After Guan Yin stopped moving, there was a mark between her brows that was neither deep nor shallow, and it was just enough to break her skin. Guan Yin opened her palm and a sword appeared in her hand. In the next moment, she charged into the sky with the sword in her hand and slashed the sword spirit. Meanwhile, the sword spirit suddenly appeared in Yixian's hand. Yixian was stunned and then he directly slashed his sword towards the sky. A strand of blood-red sword energy tore through the sky with this slash. Bang! Guan Yin retreated explosively by over 3 kilometers, but the sword energy hadn't dispersed yet, and it swept through tens of thousands of kilometers. Everywhere the sword energy passed, an ocean of blood appeared and countless Spirit of Yin race experts perished. It was like purgatory on earth. Yixian was stunned. He gazed at the sword in his hand. I'm so strong? That slash from before killed at least a few tens of thousands of Spirit of Yin race experts. The experts of the sword sect glanced at each other in the distance. The might of Yi Xian's attack was slightly abnormal. Guan Yin gazed at Yi Xian from afar, and her eyes were filled with astonishment. She hadn't expected that Yi Xian's attack would actually be so strong. It's because of the sword. Guan Yin gazed at the sword in Yi Xian's hand, and she knew that Yi Xian's attack from before was mostly because of this sword. Right at this moment Yi Xian suddenly said, "Kill! Kill!" At this moment, Guan Yin was blasted back by a single slash of his sword, and coupled with the reputation of the sword sect's founding ancestor, the spirit of Yin race could be said to have lost all their morale. It was the best time to attack. Even though there weren't many of them, the swordsman by his side was very good at fighting. When they heard Yi Xian's words, over 100 swordsmen suddenly rushed out. Over 100 super swordsmen attacked, and in an instant the sound of swords resounded through the heavens and the earth. Yi Xian rushed at the forefront, and his target was Guan Yin. This woman was too good at fighting, and if he didn't restrain her, the sword sect's swordsman wouldn't be able to stop her. Looking at Yi Xian who was rushing towards her, Guan Yin was expressionless. His face was expressionless. "Kill!" As soon as she finished speaking, she took the lead and rushed out. When Guan Yin rushed out, the spirit of Yin race experts behind her also rushed out. Guan Yin's prestige among the spirit of Yin race was still very high. The main reason was that everyone understood that at this moment, whoever retreated would suffer. Yi Xian rushed in front of Guan Yin and slashed down with his sword. A blood-red ray of light slashed down. Guan Yin didn't choose to use her sword because it was meaningless against Yi Xian. The moment Guan Yin rushed forward, she immediately became illusory, and the moment she became illusory, a mysterious force directly suppressed her. Sword domain. At this moment, a trace of ferocity flashed through Guan Yin's eyes, and she stomped her right foot on the ground. Bang! The heavens and the earth trembled in fear. Yi Xian's face instantly turned pale. Meanwhile, Guan Yin smashed her fist towards Yi Xian. She'd resisted the suppression of the sword domain and smashed her fist towards Yi Xian. She intended to shatter Yi Xian's sword domain as well. However, Yi Xian didn't dodge this punch and he slashed his sword at Guan Yin instead. Not to mention Guan Yin, even he himself wouldn't be able to resist this attack. Because the sword in his hand belonged to the green-clothed man. Moreover, it was a living sword spirit. This sword spirit's strength wasn't inferior to Guan Yin. However, its might required swordsmen to be able to bring forth its full might. Guan Yin didn't hesitate at all when facing this attack. She immediately withdrew her fist, and then she smashed it against the blade of Yi Xian's sword at a strange angle. Bang! Meanwhile, Guan Yin seized the opportunity and smashed her fist towards Yi Xian's chest. This punch caused the space in the surroundings to crack apart. However, Yi Xian didn't pay any attention to this punch. At the instant that his sword was slashed askew, he immediately let go of his sword, and then he smashed his fist towards Guan Yin's chest. Fist for fist. Bang! Along with an explosion, Yi Xian and Guan Yin instantly retreated explosively, and at the instant that Guan Yin retreated, the blood-red sword slashed towards her. Guan Yin's expression changed when she witnessed this scene. This sword is attacking on its own? What the hell? She didn't have the time to think and she suddenly pushed her arms forward. Bang! Blood-red light exploded and Guan Yin instantly retreated over 1 kilometer again. Moreover, there were numerous blood-red sword marks on her body. On the other hand, the blood-red sword had returned to Yi Xian's hand. This was a sword that had a mind of its own. Yi Xian gazed at the blood-red sword in his hand. At this moment he suddenly realized how terrifying this sword was. The soul-calming sword had a spirit as well, but it didn't have such formidable combat strength. Could be said that the soul-calming sword was a sword, and the sword in his hand wasn't just a sword anymore. Could be said that it was a swordsman. A sword that understood the sword Dao. In the distance, Guan Yin's expression gradually became gloomy. She noticed that even though Yi Xian had taken her punch head-on, he was fine. She had 3 killer moves. The first was realm suppression. However, this realm suppression could be broken by Yi Xian. The second killer move was the sword. It could be said that after the woman in the plain dress left, her sword Dao was at the peak in this world. However, Yi Xian was able to devour the sword. The third killer move was the death qi. However, Yi Xian was able to devour even the death qi. This Yi Xian was simply her nemesis. As if she had thought of something, Guan Yin suddenly raised her head. She looked towards the depths of the starry sky. Then she saw a white figure. Fifth dimension Tendo. Guan Yin's expression was somewhat ferocious. You're a good Tendo. In the starry sky, Tendo suddenly stopped and shook her head. You want to blame me for the destruction of the upper realm? You want to blame me for the destruction of the sixth dimension? Now your spirit clan is also blaming me. I'm in a difficult situation. P.S. By the way, have you all started work? You're tuning in to the Zhou Xian's Legacy YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.